A low hum rises from the jungle, not of machines, but of life itself. Cicadas scream in the thick, humid air as mist curls through a cathedral of ancient trees. Somewhere beneath the roots and shadows, something enormous sleeps. The camera pushes through vines and branches until it finds it. A broken staircase, swallowed by moss, leading to a pyramid that once touched the sun. For centuries it was hidden, a monument buried alive. Now, in the stillness of dawn, it breathes again. The narrator's voice is calm, almost reverent. Here, deep in the Petén rainforest of Guatemala, lie the remains of a world that should never have vanished. A civilization that mapped the stars, raised cities of stone, and disappeared without leaving a scream. The sound of dripping water echoes. A macaw shrieks from somewhere high above. And with that, we are pulled into one of history's greatest enigmas, the mysterious disappearance of the Maya. Drone footage soars above the treetops. Green gives way to geometry. Plazas, causeways, temples, all smothered under centuries of jungle. Beneath the canopy lies a city the size of Manhattan, once home to tens of thousands. Yet no one walks its streets. No fires burn in its hearths. No laughter echoes in its courts. Just silence, broken by the whisper of leaves. The ruins stretch on endlessly, as if the earth itself tried to forget them. The Mayan civilization, an empire of architects, astronomers, and poets, ruled the jungles of Central America for nearly 2,000 years. They carved their cities from limestone, aligned them with the heavens, and built an intricate calendar that could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They were masters of time, of stone, and of story. And then, sometime around the 9th century, their cities fell silent. Not in war, not in flame. They simply stopped. Archaeologists call it the classic Maya collapse. But even the term feels too clinical for what really happened. Imagine this. A world of millions, vibrant with art and mathematics, dissolving into jungle without leaving a single unified reason why. No great invasion. No plague sweeping through the valleys. No empire devouring another. Just abandonment. Doors left open. Tools dropped mid-use. Temples half-built and never finished. As if the builders vanished between one heartbeat and the next. It's almost unthinkable. How does a civilization with writing, science, and monumental architecture, a culture that recorded everything from royal lineages to celestial events, simply disappear? What force could be so powerful, so complete, that it erased not just the people but their very memory? The question lingers, heavy and unanswerable, like humidity in the air. But the jungle remembers. It always does. Every tree root, every vine, is a quiet act of reclamation. The forest does not bury the past. It devours it. When the Spanish conquistadors marched through these lands centuries later, they never saw the Maya's greatest cities. The jungle had hidden them so perfectly that even local legends spoke only in fragments, of ghost kings, cursed temples, and a people who once spoke to the stars. For almost a millennium, the Maya were less a history than a haunting. Then, in 1839, two travelers changed everything. John Lloyd Stevens, an American writer, and Frederick Catherwood, a British artist, hacked their way through dense forest guided by rumors of stone monuments deep in the Guatemalan wilderness. What they found defied belief. Towering pyramids rising from the jungle floor, walls covered in strange hieroglyphs, faces of gods and kings staring through the vines. Catherwood sketched them obsessively, his drawings later stunning Europe with visions of a forgotten empire. For the first time, the silence was broken, and the world realized that beneath the jungle lay not myth but memory. And yet, the more was uncovered, the deeper the mystery became. Who built these temples? Why were they abandoned? How could a civilization capable of such grandeur simply fade into the forest? Every discovery raised more questions than answers. Stevens wrote of an overwhelming melancholy that hung over the ruins, a beauty haunted by loss. Even now, standing among those stones, you can feel it, the echo of something vast, intelligent, and unfinished. Night falls over the ruins. The sky glows with a million stars, the same stars the Maya once charted, the same constellations that guided their kings. Their calendar, more precise than any in Europe at the time, measured not just days and years but cosmic cycles, the turning of worlds within worlds. They believed time itself was alive, pulsing in patterns that repeated across eternity. To them, collapse was not the end, but a transition, the close of one great cycle and the birth of another. Did they foresee their own disappearance? Or did their obsession with time somehow lead them to it? In the modern world, we measure history in centuries. The Maya measured it in eternities. That difference, that cosmic patience, may hold the key to their mystery. Because what if they didn't vanish at all? What if, in a sense, they transcended? Some scholars whisper that the collapse wasn't destruction, but migration. A deliberate abandonment of the divine cities. A rejection of kings and gods who had failed them. Others speak of climate catastrophe, rebellion, famine, or spiritual crisis. But deep beneath those theories lies a single haunting truth. We don't know. Not yet. The camera drifts through an overgrown corridor, sunlight filtering through the leaves like liquid gold. Moss coats the carvings of a long-forgotten ruler, his eyes gazing toward the horizon as if still waiting for the dawn. Somewhere nearby, a toucan calls. A sound as old as the stones themselves. The narrator's voice returns, softer now, almost intimate. They built monuments to outlast time. They mapped the heavens, believing they could speak to eternity. And yet, eternity forgot their names. A pause. Then, the music shifts. A low, rising pulse that feels like the beating of a distant heart. But what if the truth is not that they vanished, but that we stopped listening? The screen fades to black. A single title appears. The Mysterious Disappearance of the Mayan Civilization. What happened? And as the first act begins, the audience knows they're not just watching a story about the past. They're stepping into the silence of a vanished world, where the jungle still guards the secret of humanity's most enduring mystery. The jungle breathes like a living thing. Thick fog curls around towering ceiba trees as unseen creatures rustle through the undergrowth. It's the 1840s, and a pair of exhausted men hack their way through a green labyrinth with machetes that grow dull from the endless vines. Sweat runs down their necks. The air is hot enough to choke. Each step forward feels like trespassing into another time. Then, suddenly, the jungle opens, and before them rises something impossible. A wall of stone, carved with the faces of gods long forgotten, staring back through centuries of silence. One of the men drops his pack. The other whispers, almost afraid to speak, "We've found it." John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, adventurers, scholars, and dreamers, had come chasing rumors. Whispers of lost cities, hidden in the heart of Central America, where ancient people once built pyramids as high as cathedrals and palaces that glowed in moonlight. Locals spoke of them in hushed tones, calling them cursed places where spirits still walked. But the Europeans dismissed these stories as fantasy, the kind of legends travelers tell when the night grows too dark. Until now, because standing before Stevens and Catherwood is proof, cold, solid, breathtaking proof, that the stories were real. Their first discovery is Copan, a ruined city on the edge of present-day Honduras. The jungle has claimed everything. Temples buried under roots, steely cracked and toppled, staircases that lead nowhere. But even half-consumed, the beauty is undeniable. Catherwood sets up his sketching tools, tracing every line, every glyph, every curve of stone. Stevens moves slowly through the ruins, his boots sinking into damp soil, heart pounding. He cannot believe that no one in the modern world has seen this before. These are not the crude relics of some primitive tribe. These are works of genius, mathematical, architectural, divine. At night, they camp among the ruins. The forest hums with life. Stevens writes in his journal by the light of a flickering lantern. "We stood among the monuments of a people who have passed away, with no history, no tradition, no trace of them remaining, except these buildings." The words carry both awe and sorrow. It is the loneliness of standing in the graveyard of gods. The next morning, they press on. Days turn into weeks as they journey deeper into the Yucatan Peninsula. They travel by mule, canoe, and foot, across rivers, through swamps, through jungles so thick the sun disappears. And then, one day, they stumble upon another lost world. They name it Palenque. Here, the temples rise out of the mist like stone ships sailing through a sea of green. Massive stairways lead to shrines decorated with intricate carvings. Glyphs cover every wall, rows of symbols that no one on earth can read. They depict kings with elaborate headdresses, serpents coiling from their mouths, and celestial beings descending from the sky. The artistry is hypnotic, the language of a forgotten theology. Catherwood works tirelessly, his pencil gliding across the page, capturing the ruins before time devours them completely. His drawings will later stun Europe, cities lost to history, revealed in exquisite detail. People call them the American Egypt. But unlike Egypt, there are no written records to explain who these people were, how they lived, or why they vanished. Their stories, their science, their gods, all swallowed by jungle and silence. Local Maya villagers watch the foreigners from a distance. They know these places. They have always known. To them, these are not lost cities. They are sacred wounds in the earth, remnants of something powerful and dangerous. The villagers tell Stevens and Catherwood the names passed down through generations. Uxmal, Kaba, Chichen Itza. They warn that spirits guard these ruins, that to disturb them invites misfortune. When the wind rises, they say it is the breath of the old gods, still angry, still waiting. Stevens listens politely, but part of him wonders, could there be truth in these tales? In the evenings, Catherwood's candle burns late into the night as he sketches by hand. Outside, the jungle whispers. The hoot of an owl echoes through the ruins. Somewhere in the distance, a jaguar growls. Every sound feels amplified, as though the city itself is alive. The two men speak little, too overwhelmed by what they are witnessing. In their silence, they feel the weight of something vast, the ghost of a civilization far older, far stranger than they had imagined. They soon realize that Copan and Palenque are not isolated wonders. They are pieces of a greater whole, a network of cities stretching across hundreds of miles, connected by causeways, rivers, and trade routes. The jungle, it seems, is hiding an entire civilization, not just fragments. The magnitude is staggering. How could a culture this advanced simply vanish, leaving only stone? Stevens begins to speculate in his notes. Maybe they were conquered. Maybe famine, war, or disease brought them down. Or perhaps they simply walked away, abandoning their temples and gods to return to the forest. None of it makes sense. There are no signs of massive destruction, no armies, no layers of ash or ruin. The cities died quietly, as though the people simply decided one day to stop being who they were. The mystery consumes them. As they travel to more sites, Uxmal, Kaba, Chichen Itza, the pattern repeats. Greatness turned to ruin, order surrendered to chaos, beauty fading into moss. Each city feels like a chapter torn from a book no one can read. The glyphs, carved into stone with obsessive precision, taunt them. They know the key lies in those symbols, but no one in the modern world can decipher them. They are looking at voices frozen in time, stories trapped behind a wall of silence. And yet, amid that silence, something stirs. Stevens begins to sense that these places are not entirely dead. He writes that at night, under the moonlight, the ruins seem to breathe, as if waiting to be remembered. The jungle winds sigh through the corridors like the murmuring of an unseen crowd. Sometimes, he says, it feels as though someone is watching. Not ghosts, perhaps, but history itself, refusing to be forgotten. When the two men finally return home, they bring with them not treasure but truth. Their books and sketches ignite the imagination of the world. Suddenly, the Maya are no longer a myth whispered by explorers. They are real, magnificent, and utterly mysterious. Scholars rush to study them, artists paint them, writers romanticize them. But beneath all the fascination lies a single, unnerving question. If a civilization this advanced could disappear so completely, what does that say about our own? In the decades that follow, more explorers come. More temples are uncovered. But none can shake the same feeling Stevens described in his journal. That strange mix of awe and sorrow, of wonder and loss. The jungle has given up its secret, but not its explanation. The stones tell us everything except why. The screen fades to black. The sound of insects fills the air. The narrator's voice returns, low and reflective. They were never truly lost. We were lost in our forgetting. And as the camera lingers on the ancient carvings glistening in the torchlight, the story moves forward, toward the rise of a civilization that once believed it could command the heavens, and the terrible beauty of what happened when it tried. Morning breaks over the jungle, but it is not the quiet dawn of wilderness. It is a slow unveiling of stone. As the first light spills across the treetops, the mist thins to reveal something rising out of the green. Terraces, towers, staircases that climb toward the sun. A forgotten city awakens. The camera drifts through the air like a ghost, passing over vast plazas and pyramids that shimmer in gold light. Birds take flight, their wings scattering echoes through the valley. The narrator speaks softly, his voice filled with wonder. Once, this was the beating heart of the Maya world, cities that touched the heavens, kingdoms built in the shadow of eternity. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, their names whisper through the centuries like spells. Each one was a miracle of ambition, carved not from empire-wide command but from countless city-states, each ruled by kings who called themselves divine. To the Maya, cities were not mere places of residence. They were living beings, cosmic engines aligned to the heartbeat of the gods. From high atop the temples, rulers watched the sun rise in perfect symmetry with their monuments, believing that by doing so they were ensuring the continuation of the world itself. In Tikal, the city rose from a sea of green like a crown. Its twin pyramids, Temple I and Temple II, faced each other across the Grand Plaza. One the tomb of a king, the other the monument of his queen. Their limestone faces glowed in the morning sun, and from their summits, one could see nothing but endless jungle and the curve of the sky. When the drums sounded and incense burned, the entire city must have felt alive. Tens of thousands gathering in the plazas, their chants rising like thunder through the trees. Every stone here carried purpose, every shadow meaning. Further west lay Palenque, smaller but more intricate, the city of dreams. Here, the temples were more refined, the sculptures more delicate, as if the artisans had carved stone the way poets shape language. Its greatest ruler, Kinich Jenab Pakal, ruled for nearly 70 years, building palaces adorned with stucco reliefs that told the story of his divine lineage. In the Temple of the Inscriptions, beneath layers of carved glyphs, his tomb lay sealed for over 1,000 years. A sarcophagus lid depicting the king not in death, but in transformation, falling into the jaws of the underworld, destined to be reborn as a god. The Maya did not build for glory. They built for eternity. Copan, to the south, was a city of scholars. Its stairways were inscribed with history, more than 2,000 glyphs chronicling dynasties and rituals, a kind of stone library of the ancient world. The precision of their carvings, the mathematical harmony of their proportions, spoke of a civilization that understood both logic and spirit. The Maya were engineers, yes, but also philosophers. They saw geometry as sacred, mathematics as divine language. The arc of the sun, the orbit of Venus, the rhythm of seasons, all were woven into the design of their temples. To live in a Maya city was to live inside the cosmos itself. And yet, for all their splendor, these cities were not merely political centers. They were instruments, immense calendars of stone, aligned to the stars. Every building, every street, every ceremonial platform was placed with precision. On the equinox, sunlight would pierce the heart of the temples exactly at noon. On solstices, shadows would trace the wings of the serpent god Kukulkan across the steps of Chichen Itza. It was as if the Maya had built their cities not to observe time, but to participate in it, to ensure the balance between heaven and earth remained unbroken. The people themselves lived in the outskirts, farmers, artisans, merchants, their thatched homes surrounding the monumental centers. The Maya were not an empire but a network of interconnected city-states, each with its own lords, its own gods, and its own rivalries. And yet, through trade, art, and shared cosmology, They formed one of the most sophisticated societies the world had ever seen. They had no beasts of burden, no wheels, no iron tools, yet they constructed cities that rivaled the greatest achievements of Egypt and Rome. It was a triumph not of conquest, but of intellect. As the narrator's voice softens, the scene shifts from grandeur to intimacy, a glimpse into daily life. Women weaving bright textiles, traders crossing rivers in canoes loaded with cacao beans, children chasing dogs across courtyards. At dusk, the smell of burning copal resin fills the air as priests ascend temple stairs, their torches flickering in the wind. From above, the city glows like a constellation on earth. Every fire, every prayer, every heartbeat a reflection of the stars above. But beneath the harmony, tension brews. The kings who ruled these cities were both divine and human, responsible not only for governance but for maintaining cosmic order. If drought struck, if crops failed, if war came, the blame fell upon them. To be a ruler was to balance the universe on one's shoulders. And so, the kings built higher, sacrificed more, and demanded absolute devotion. The competition between city-states grew fierce. Each ruler sought to outshine his rivals, in architecture, in war, in the blood offered to the gods. The narrator pauses, his tone darkening. Greatness often carries the seeds of its own undoing. In the pursuit of divine perfection, the Maya cities began to push against the limits of their world. Forests were cut down to build temples and feed fires for lime plaster. Farmlands stretched thin. Populations swelled. The gods demanded more, and the kings obeyed. Yet still the heavens turned, indifferent. A soft rain begins to fall over the ruins, pattering against the camera lens. The narrator's voice returns, lower now, more reflective. These cities were born from the belief that human hands could mirror the perfection of the cosmos. But perfection, once achieved, leaves nowhere to go. The shot widens, temples rising like islands above an endless green ocean, mist swallowing their summits one by one. Even now, the ruins hold a strange presence. Archaeologists describe the eerie quiet that hangs over them at dawn, the sense that time stands still. The hieroglyphs carved into stone still glow faintly under torchlight, their lines sharp despite 1,000 years of rain. It is as though the Maya built not merely for their age, but for all ages to come, defying decay itself. And yet, for all their genius, the cities stand as warnings as much as wonders. The Maya mastered time, but time mastered them in the end. For somewhere in this golden age of sky and stone lies the first shadow of collapse. A whisper of drought, a rumor of rebellion, a god who stopped listening. As the camera drifts upward, breaking through the canopy into open sky, the narrator's final words linger. They built to touch the heavens. But when the heavens turned away, all that remained was stone. The music fades, leaving only the hum of the jungle below. Ancient, eternal, waiting for the next story to rise from the dust. Night falls slowly over the jungle. The temples, once blazing gold under the sun, now shimmer under the pale glow of the moon. Torches flicker at the base of stone staircases, their smoke curling upward like silent prayers. The stars appear, one by one, until the entire sky becomes an ocean of light. And there, beneath it all, stand the Maya, the people who measured time not in years, but in breaths of the cosmos. For them, the sky was not just decoration. It was a map, a living text written by the gods themselves. Every flicker, every movement, every shadow had meaning. To understand the Maya is to understand their obsession with time, an obsession so vast, so intricate, that even our most advanced computers could barely match its precision. Long before telescopes or modern mathematics, the Maya charted the paths of Venus, the Moon, and the Sun with astonishing accuracy. They knew that the planet Venus would reappear in the dawn sky every 584 days. They tracked eclipses centuries in advance. They understood that time was not a straight line but a circle, a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that governed not only the heavens, but every human life. In their worldview, the universe itself had a rhythm. Every cycle, the turning of seasons, the growth of corn, the rise and fall of dynasties, echoed the great cosmic heartbeat. Their calendars did not simply count days. They gave days identity, personality, destiny. A Mayan priest could tell you what kind of person you were based on the day you were born, what the gods expected of you, when you should marry, when you should plant, when you should die. Time was alive, divine, a being to be courted and respected. The great long count calendar, perhaps the most famous of all, was their attempt to capture eternity. It stretched across thousands of years, marking not just human history but cosmic eras. To the Maya, we live within just one sun, one age among many. Before us, there were others, worlds destroyed by fire, flood, and darkness. Each world ends and another begins. When their calendar cycle approached its turning point in the year 2012, the modern world panicked, misreading it as a prophecy of apocalypse. But the Maya never predicted an end, only a transformation, a renewal. To them, endings were sacred. The gods destroy only to create again. Imagine standing in one of their observatories centuries ago. The stone walls align perfectly with the solstice sun. Priests in feathered cloaks climb the steps as conch shells sound through the night. They raise their arms to the stars, reading the language of light. Every planet, every flicker of starlight is a word, every constellation a sentence. The sky speaks, and the Maya listen. It is not superstition, it is devotion to order, to symmetry, to the idea that the cosmos and humankind are part of the same eternal pattern. Their greatest calendar, the Hab, counted 365 days, a solar year. But alongside it ran another, the Tsokin, a sacred cycle of 260 days, tied to ritual and destiny. The interplay between these two calendars created a grander cycle, the calendar round, lasting 52 years. To complete one calendar round was to return to the beginning, to relive the same sacred alignment of time. And so, every 52 years, the Maya would perform the new fire ceremony, extinguishing all flames, plunging their cities into darkness, waiting through the long night until the first spark of dawn rekindled the world. It was a reminder. Life is fleeting, but the pattern continues. To the Maya, the gods were not distant. They lived in time itself, each moment an intersection of divine forces. A farmer planting corn did not merely sow seeds. He was reenacting the first planting of the gods. A king performing a bloodletting ritual was not simply shedding his own blood. He was feeding the veins of the universe. Every action mirrored a cosmic act. The sacred and the mundane were one. Their hieroglyphs, too, reveal this intimacy with time. A single glyph could mark a day with both its date and its essence, a combination of number and symbol representing the personality of that moment. For example, a day might be 8 Ajah, signifying leadership, fire, and renewal. To be born on that day meant inheriting its power. This connection between calendar and identity shaped everything, from politics to prophecy. The kings ruled not only by bloodline but by the timing of their birth. If a ruler's calendar sign aligned with divine cycles, his legitimacy was absolute. But with such precision came anxiety. The Maya believed that if time was not properly honored, if the rituals failed, if the gods were not fed, the entire cosmic rhythm could falter. Their priests spent their lives ensuring that the sacred count remained unbroken. They watched the skies night after night, calculating, adjusting, correcting. In their minds, the stability of heaven itself depended on their vigilance. The weight of eternity rested on human hands. The narrator's tone softens. They were not just keeping time, they were keeping the universe alive. At Palenque, inscriptions describe a moment billions of years in the past, the birth of their gods at the beginning of creation. These were not myths but measurements. The Maya calculated back to the dawn of the world itself, anchoring their present in the infinite past. And when they looked forward, they saw beyond the reach of our own imagination. Thousands of years into the future, cycles repeating endlessly, civilizations rising and falling like the phases of the moon. Their mathematics made it possible. Using only dots and bars, they invented the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. 0, the idea of nothingness as a value, as a place in the sequence of creation. With it, they built equations that describe time as a living spiral, forever turning inward and outward. In their temples, they didn't just mark the passage of time, they shaped it, gave it structure. As the camera pans over carved stone calendars, their glyphs illuminated by torchlight, the narrator continues. For them, the past was never gone, the future never born. Everything existed at once, in an eternal cycle of return. And perhaps that is the greatest secret of the Maya. They understood time not as something that takes from us, but something that gives back. The day you die, they believed, another you is born in another age under the same stars walking the same earth. The music swells, and the camera rises above a temple aligned perfectly with the setting sun. The last rays of light strike its summit, then fade into shadow. The narrator whispers, almost a prayer. They did not fear the end. They measured it. The screen fades to black. A low drumbeat echoes, the rhythm of time itself. The silence lingers for a breath, and then a single line appears. But even the masters of time could not stop what was coming. Beneath the canopy of emerald leaves, the stone cities of the Maya were not merely built. They were composed, like sacred hymns carved in limestone. Every temple, every plaza, every stairway rising into the humid air was part of a cosmic diagram, a divine blueprint connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. These were not random cities grown from human ambition. They were instruments of celestial harmony, aligned with the movements of stars and gods alike. To walk through a Mayan city was to walk through a living model of the universe. The Maya believed that the world was divided into three realms: the heavens above, the earthly plane, and the dark, mysterious underworld known as Xibalba. The cities they built reflected this triad perfectly. Temples reached skyward like sacred mountains, piercing the heavens. The plazas below represented the world of humans, where markets bustled and ceremonies unfolded. And beneath them, buried chambers, tombs, and reservoirs symbolized the depths of Xibalba. The Maya didn't just build cities. They recreated the architecture of existence itself. At the heart of every city stood its temple, the Axis Mundi or world center, where the divine and the mortal touched. These towering pyramids were not simply monuments to kings. They were stairways to the gods. Each step carried priests and rulers closer to the celestial realm, each platform representing a layer of the cosmos. When a king ascended to perform rituals at the summit, he wasn't just conducting politics. He was reenacting the first moments of creation, calling forth the gods to renew the world once more. But there was a deeper, almost mathematical precision behind their beauty. The Maya oriented their temples to match celestial events, the solstices, equinoxes, and planetary alignments that dictated their ritual calendar. In Chichen Itza, for example, the Temple of Kukulkan was designed so that on the equinox, shadows cast by the setting sun form the shape of a serpent descending the pyramid side. As the light slides down the stone steps, the illusion of a great feathered serpent, the god Kukulkan himself, appears to slither to the earth. For the Maya, this wasn't just an illusion. It was proof that the boundary between heaven and earth could still be crossed. Other cities, like Tikal and Copan, mirrored constellations or solar pathways. Their builders used the horizon as their canvas, measuring angles and alignments so precise that modern astronomers still marvel at them. Observatories such as the Caracol at Chichen Itza were positioned to track Venus, whose cycles guided war, agriculture, and prophecy. The appearance of Venus at dawn could mean the blessing of the gods, or a warning of death. To ignore these signs was to risk cosmic imbalance. The architecture was not just for the eye, it was for the soul. When sunlight filtered through temple doorways, it did so at exact moments, casting shapes that symbolized rebirth, sacrifice, or divine union. The entire city would glow differently depending on the season, as if the gods themselves were painting with light. It was a world alive with symbolism, where every shadow had meaning and every echo carried a prayer. And yet, the same structures that celebrated harmony also revealed tension, the quiet, growing fear that balance could be broken. The Maya knew that every cycle contained its opposite. Creation implied destruction. Order implied chaos. Their inscriptions speak not just of triumphs but of omens. Eclipses, droughts, and the anger of gods neglected. Their rulers, seen as intermediaries between worlds, bore the burden of maintaining equilibrium. If the crops failed or war ravaged the land, it was the king's fault, not as a politician, but as a cosmic custodian who had failed to keep the rhythm. The divine blueprint of the cities thus doubled as a warning. If the temples fell out of alignment, if the rituals faltered, the connection to the divine would weaken. The gods, starved of their offerings of blood and incense, might abandon the people. And when the gods turned their faces away, time itself could unravel. In this way, their architecture becomes almost tragic, a perfection built on fear. The same hands that sculpted beauty into stone did so under the weight of divine expectation. The city wasn't merely a place to live. It was a promise to the heavens. A single misstep, a missed ceremony, or a broken cycle could mean the end of everything. Every pyramid, every inscription whispered the same truth. The gods give, and the gods take. To the Maya, even the act of construction was sacred theater. Before laying the first stone, priests performed rituals to awaken the site spirit. Offerings, jade, shells, even human hearts, were buried beneath the foundations to anchor the structure to the underworld. As walls rose, chants filled the air, binding stone to sky with sound. Builders didn't see themselves as mere laborers. They were participating in the ongoing creation of the world. To build was to pray. The cities thus became chronicles of faith and fear. At Copan, stelae depict kings offering their blood to the gods, their faces serene despite the agony. At Palenque, the Temple of the Inscriptions holds a tomb carved with a vision of the ruler Pacal descending into the underworld, not as a mortal dying, but as a god reborn. Every carving, every figure, is a page in the cosmic story the Maya told themselves, that human life is only a reflection of divine patterns, and that the destiny of kings mirrors the destiny of stars. But as centuries passed, something shifted. The alignments began to feel uncertain. The sky still moved as it always had, but the world below it trembled. Droughts lengthened, wars multiplied, cities expanded beyond their means. The delicate harmony encoded in their divine blueprint began to crack. The very geometry that once promised balance now seemed to mock them. Temples aligned to the sun became monuments to desperation. Priests bleeding themselves beneath the same light that no longer blessed the cornfields. And yet they did not abandon their faith. They built higher, carved deeper, prayed louder, trying to call back the gods who were already slipping away. Perhaps they believed that by perfecting their cities, they could restore the order of heaven. But each new construction only seemed to hasten their exhaustion. The camera would drift through the ruins, moss crawling up stairways, rain dripping into silent courtyards, as the narrator whispers. They built their world as a mirror of the gods. But what happens when the reflection begins to fade? The divine blueprint that once united the Maya under celestial order would, in time, become the blueprint of their downfall. The same knowledge that made them masters of time and architecture would blind them to the reality unfolding before their eyes. That no matter how perfectly one mirrors the heavens, even the stars cannot save a world that forgets how to breathe. The music fades, leaving the soft sound of rain on stone, a rhythm as old as the gods themselves. And beneath it, a quiet question lingers, inviting the viewer into the next mystery. When the gods fell silent, who did the Maya turn to? In the cities of the Maya, kings did not rule, they manifested. They were not merely men with crowns and armies. They were living embodiments of the divine order, walking bridges between heaven and earth. Their faces were carved into stone with the calm of eternity, their blood mingling with incense smoke rising toward the gods. To the Maya, a king was not chosen by birth alone but by destiny, by the rhythm of the calendar and the alignment of the stars. His rule was written into the fabric of time itself. When a ruler ascended the throne, it was not a political ceremony but a cosmic reenactment of creation. He would climb the temple steps dressed in quetzal feathers and jaguar pelts, each color representing the elements of the universe. Blue for the sky, green for the earth, red for blood. Drums would thunder from below as priests chanted the sacred names of gods. The people gathered in the plaza would see their ruler appear against the horizon, his silhouette merging with the rising sun. In that instant, he ceased to be mortal. He became the axis of the world, the keeper of balance, the living god upon whom the fate of the realm depended. Every act of rulership was infused with divine purpose. The king was expected to intercede with the gods, to maintain cosmic equilibrium through ritual sacrifice. His blood was considered the most potent offering, the very essence that kept the universe alive. During the sacred bloodletting rituals, he would pierce his tongue or genitals with obsidian blades, letting the blood drip onto strips of paper, which were then burned so that the smoke could carry his life force upward. The people believed that through this agony, their ruler nourished the gods and renewed the world. It was not cruelty but covenant. The king's pain was a mirror of divine suffering, echoing the first sacrifices of the gods who gave life to humanity. His duty was eternal vigilance, to interpret omens, to read the stars, to act as the human embodiment of the god's will. The palace was his temple, the throne his altar. In return, the people offered him devotion bordering on worship. They saw in him the face of Kukulkan, the strength of Chak the rain god, the wisdom of Itsamna. But divinity has a cost. The same rituals that elevated kings also chained them. If the rains failed, if famine spread, if war brought ruin, it was the ruler who was blamed. His divine link meant that every earthly failure echoed in the heavens. When drought lingered or the crops withered under relentless suns, the people whispered that their king had lost favor with the gods. The once revered living deity became a man haunted by his own humanity, a god who could bleed and perhaps die. In the great cities of Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul, royal bloodlines intertwined with myth. Each new ruler traced his ancestry back to divine ancestors. Some even claimed descent from the gods themselves. Stele recorded these genealogies in intricate glyphs, chronicling not just human history but sacred continuity. A ruler's legitimacy came from his ability to sustain the cosmic pattern, to prove through ritual and warfare that the divine order still flowed through his veins. Yet, beneath the splendor and faith, cracks began to form. Power has a way of corrupting even the sacred. Rival kings began to see themselves not as servants of the gods, but as gods in their own right. Wars erupted not for survival, but for dominance, each claiming divine right over others. Temples once built to honor celestial balance became monuments to ego. Cities that had thrived in harmony with the earth turned against each other, their alliances breaking apart under the weight of ambition. The people, once united under shared faith, began to suffer. The endless wars demanded more tribute, more labor, more blood. Captives taken from rival cities were paraded through plazas and sacrificed at the foot of temples. Their deaths meant to feed the gods and prove a ruler's favor. But the rains did not always return. The gods grew silent, or perhaps the people could no longer hear them through the cries of the dying. Imagine standing in a Mayan plaza in those final golden centuries. Incense thick in the air, drums echoing through the jungle, the king high above the crowd, his face painted in the patterns of gods. To the people below, he is everything. Savior, Father, link to eternity. Yet behind the mask, behind the jewels and divine titles, there is a man, one who knows the crops are failing, who sees the rivers shrinking, who dreams of omens written in fire. His advisors tell him the gods must be appeased. The priests whisper that more sacrifices are needed, and so the rituals grow darker, more desperate. In Palenque, the great ruler Pakal the Great left behind inscriptions portraying his descent into the underworld as a god reborn. But after him, his city began to fade. In Tikal, dynasties that had lasted centuries fell in violent wars, their monuments defaced, their kings erased from memory. The divine link that once united the Maya in cosmic harmony had become a web of rivalry and vengeance. And yet, even as the system began to crumble, the faith endured. The Maya did not lose belief in their gods. They simply could not understand why the gods had turned away. Some rulers sought to reignite divine favor through immense temple projects, pouring their remaining resources into stone and ritual. Others turned to mystics and prophets, searching for hidden meanings in the stars. The divine kings became shadows of their former selves, trapped between heaven and earth, neither fully divine nor fully human, struggling to hold a collapsing cosmos together with nothing but faith. The most haunting part of their story is not their fall, but their persistence. Even as famine and conflict spread, the kings continued to perform their duties, bleeding on altars, calling out to silent skies. It was not arrogance that kept them going, but a kind of tragic devotion, the belief that if they stopped, if they gave up their rituals, the world itself would end. And perhaps, in a way, it did. The camera lingers on a ruined temple, its summit swallowed by jungle. Moss creeps across the carved face of a long-dead ruler, his features weathered by centuries of rain. The narrator's voice is soft, almost mournful. They believed they were gods, and for a time, perhaps they were. But even gods cannot rule forever. The wind sighs through the trees, carrying the faint echoes of drums that no longer sound. The image fades to black, and a new question rises like mist from the jungle floor. When the divine failed, who dared to challenge the gods themselves? The jungle remembers everything. The echo of drums, the murmur of prayers, the cries of war. But by the time the 7th century turned into the 8th, those sounds began to change. The temples still stood, towering over the canopy, but their purpose began to shift. The people still gathered in the plazas, but now their faces were harder, their eyes more uncertain. The divine kings, once seen as the living bridge between man and God, began to falter. And when gods falter, mortals begin to question. For generations, the Maya had placed absolute faith in their rulers. Every victory, every harvest, every sunrise was seen as a reflection of the king's sacred power. But when the rains failed and the cornfields turned to dust, that faith began to crack like dry earth. Inscriptions from once glorious cities tell a story of omens and disquiet, of celestial alignments gone wrong, of rulers who turned to blood and fire in their desperation to summon divine mercy. Across the lowlands, the people began to whisper. Had the gods grown angry, or had their kings simply lied? The first signs of unrest were subtle. In smaller towns and border settlements, tribute deliveries began to slow. Messengers sent from the capitals returned with excuses or not at all. Soldiers marched out to enforce obedience, but the resistance they met was new, not from rival kingdoms, but from their own people. Farmers hid their grain. Villagers refused to build new temples. Inscriptions that once celebrated royal triumphs began to fall silent, the proud stele left unfinished. The silence itself was a rebellion. In the grand cities, Tikal, Köpen, Kalakmul, the royal courts tried to restore order. They announced new festivals, new rituals of renewal, promising that the gods would reward faith once more. Processions of priests carried burning torches through the plazas, their chants echoing through the night. The kings bled themselves beneath the sun until their skin turned pale, offering their lives to the heavens in exchange for rain. But the clouds remained thin, and the rivers still shrank. The droughts came more frequently now. Crops failed, and the jungle, once so generous, began to turn hostile. The sacred cenotes, the deep wells of the earth, dried at their edges. Without water, the crops could not grow. Without corn, the people could not eat. And without people, the cities began to empty. The balance that had held for centuries was shifting, and with it, the very faith that bound the Maya together. The rebellion did not begin as a war. It began as hunger. Entire villages packed what little they owned and walked away from the great cities. Some fled into the highlands, others deeper into the jungle. Abandoned homes turned to dust, fields overgrown with vines. The once glorious capitals, shining with jade and limestone, began to decay from within, not conquered by foreign armies, but hollowed out by silence. Yet there were others who refused to surrender. The priesthood, seeing the people's faith falter, doubled down on devotion. In some cities, the rituals grew darker, bloodier. Captives were sacrificed in increasing numbers, not to terrify, but to plead. Children, warriors, even nobles were offered to the gods in desperate hope of restoration. The plazas that once celebrated the dance of creation now ran red with sacrifice. The smoke of burning hearts rose toward the indifferent sky. Still, the heavens remained unmoved. The sun rose and set, the stars followed their ancient courses, but the rains did not return. Some began to whisper that the gods themselves were dying, starved of faith, or that the cycles of time had shifted beyond human control. The priests tried to reinterpret the calendar, seeking patterns that might explain the suffering. But what they found only deepened their fear, signs that the world was nearing the end of its age. In this crucible of despair, the unthinkable happened. The divine kingship itself was challenged. For the first time in centuries, the idea that rulers were gods became suspect. Rebellions flared in the outer provinces, peasants storming temples, burning effigies of their rulers, shattering stelae that once bore their likenesses. Across the lowlands, kings vanished, assassinated, overthrown, or simply abandoned by followers who no longer believed. The symbols of divine authority, jade masks, sacred headdresses, obsidian blades, were cast aside. The age of living gods was ending, replaced by the chaos of the human will. But chaos, too, had a strange kind of freedom. As the centralized kingdoms fell, smaller city-states began to assert themselves. Local rulers, men once dismissed as minor nobles or generals, rose to power, claiming to rule not by divine right, but by human strength. They promised protection and prosperity in exchange for loyalty. Some succeeded for a time, carving small empires from the remains of greater ones. Others fell into endless cycles of war. The old unity of belief fractured, replaced by competing visions of survival. The jungle grew thicker around their ruins. The great roads, once filled with traders and pilgrims, became overgrown. The sacred ball courts stood empty. The songs of devotion faded into the rustle of leaves and the cry of distant birds. And yet, even in this unraveling, the people carried something with them. Fragments of the old faith woven into new stories. The gods did not disappear. They transformed, becoming spirits of the forest, the rain, the dead. In a way, the rebellion was not just against kings, but against the idea that time and fate belonged to anyone at all. The Maya had always believed that the universe was cyclical, that destruction was not an ending but a renewal. And perhaps, unconsciously, they were living that belief. The fall of their great cities was not annihilation. It was transformation. The gods of empire fell silent so that new voices could be heard, humbler, earthbound, human. Imagine the final festival at a dying city. The torches still burn, the drums still beat, but there are fewer people in the crowd. The king stands upon the temple steps, his robes tattered, his eyes hollow. He raises his hands to the sky, calling for the rain that never comes. Below him, the people turn away, walking into the jungle without a word. The drums fade, the fires dim, and the temple, once a gateway to heaven, becomes a tomb. The narrator's voice lowers, carrying a tone of sorrow and awe. When faith becomes fear, when gods fall silent, the people learn to listen to the earth again. And in that silence, something ancient awakens, not destruction, but the beginning of something new. The camera pulls back over the ruins swallowed by vines, the jungle whispering over stone, as if reclaiming what was always hers. The narrator leaves one question hanging, soft but heavy with meaning. Did the Maya fall, or did they simply walk away from the gods they had built? The jungle has always been alive, breathing, whispering, watching. But for the Maya it began to change. The trees still rose high, their roots still clutched the earth, but the air grew heavier, the rivers thinner, the sky harsher. What had once been the giver of life, rain, soil, sunlight, began to turn against them. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the rhythm of the natural world, the same rhythm they had worshipped for centuries, began to falter. Nature, their oldest ally, had become their silent adversary. For generations, the Maya had thrived because they understood their environment better than almost any civilization before them. They built great cities in landscapes that seemed impossible to sustain life. Dense jungles, dry plains, swampy lowlands. They tamed rivers, diverted rainwater, and carved vast reservoirs into limestone. Their farmers, working beneath a sun that could scorch the skin in minutes, learned to coax maize, beans, and squash from the reluctant soil. It was an act of genius and an act of faith. The earth, they believed, was sacred, and their bond with it eternal. But bonds can break. Archaeologists now believe that sometime between the late 8th and 9th centuries, the climate of the Yucatan Peninsula began to shift dramatically. The rains, once predictable as the stars, began to fail. The wet seasons shortened, the dry ones lengthened. Lakes that had sustained cities for centuries began to shrink. The cenotes, those sacred wells believed to be gateways to the underworld, receded, their crystal depths turning cloudy. For a civilization that depended on rain for everything, crops, ritual, even identity, this was not merely drought. It was apocalypse. At first, the Maya responded as they always had, with ritual and faith. Priests read the stars for answers, consulted the calendar for omens. Kings offered sacrifices, promising the return of balance. In some cities, temples were rebuilt or expanded, as though stone could persuade the heavens to open again. But the skies remained empty. The droughts deepened, stretching across generations. The soil, once rich with nutrients, became dry and pale. Without water, even the gods seemed to wither. The collapse was not sudden. It crept like the jungle vines, slow, steady, unstoppable. Cities that had flourished for centuries began to shrink. Farmers left their fields to find refuge elsewhere, carrying their gods and their grief with them. Trade routes broke down. Without surplus crops, markets dwindled. The temples, once overflowing with offerings, grew quiet. The sacred fires burned low. Some rulers refused to see the truth. They doubled down on ceremony, believing that greater sacrifice would win back divine favor. The plazas echoed with the sound of drums and the cries of victims. Rain dances turned to mourning rituals. Entire cities became altars of desperation. The faith that had sustained the Maya for millennia was now consuming them. Others tried to adapt. Ingenious engineers built new reservoirs and canals, digging deeper into the earth to find hidden water. Some communities moved into the highlands, where rainfall was more abundant. But migration meant abandoning the sacred centers, the very heart of their civilization. To leave a city like Tikal or Copan was to leave behind not just a home, but a world. For the Maya, every stone, every plaza, every temple was tied to the gods. Abandonment felt like betrayal. And yet, one by one, the great cities fell silent. Copan, once a glittering jewel of the southern lowlands, suffered under deforestation and eroded soil. Without trees to anchor the land, floods followed droughts, washing away what little remained. In the north, places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal endured longer, but even they faced the shadow of scarcity. The gods of rain, once benevolent, became figures of terror. Offerings increased. The pits of sacrifice filled. But the heavens stayed closed. Imagine the sound of it, the stillness of a dry season that never ends. The fields cracked open, animals fled, and the air shimmered with heat. The rivers that once reflected the stars became lines of white dust. The people waited for the storm clouds that no longer came. For a civilization that had built its identity on understanding time, cycles, and balance, the drought was not just natural disaster. It was a spiritual crisis. The Maya had always believed in cycles, the idea that every end was a beginning. But as the droughts stretched into decades, that faith was tested. What happens when the cycle stops? What if the rain never returns? What if the gods themselves die of thirst? These were not questions of science. They were questions of survival and meaning. And in that questioning, something profound happened. Some communities began to shift their focus from the divine to the earthly. They started relying less on royal rituals and more on local leadership. Farmers and villagers took control of their own survival, forming smaller, self-sufficient settlements. It was as if the collapse of the great cities forced a return to humility, to the simple truth that the earth could not be commanded, only respected. In the ruins of Tikal, archaeologists have found traces of rituals performed long after the city was abandoned. Small offerings left in the cracks of temple floors, pottery filled with charred maize, tokens of hope. It suggests that even as their world crumbled, the people did not lose faith entirely. They adapted it, They redefined their relationship with nature, no longer as masters of divine order, but as wanderers seeking harmony again. The narrator's voice would soften, carrying both awe and sorrow. It was not a single drought that ended the Maya. It was a conversation between humanity and the earth, one that slowly turned into silence. We like to imagine collapse as sudden, cities burning, empires falling overnight. But the Maya's end was quieter. It was the sound of footsteps fading into the forest, of fires left to die in empty plazas. It was the whisper of wind over dry stone, carrying prayers unanswered. And yet, as the centuries passed, the jungle began to reclaim what was lost. Roots cracked open temples, moss swallowed stairways, birds nested in the mouths of carved gods. The forest that once sustained the Maya now consumed their monuments, turning cities back into nature. Perhaps, in that cycle of decay and rebirth, the Maya found what they had always sought: balance. The earth had taken back what was hers, and in doing so completed the circle. The scene closes on a sweeping aerial shot, endless green stretching to the horizon, with the tops of ancient pyramids breaking through the canopy like the tips of forgotten mountains. The narrator whispers, "They thought the gods had abandoned them, but maybe it was the earth, reminding them that nothing built against its rhythm can endure." And then, softly, almost as an afterthought, the Maya never truly vanished. They simply listened to the silence and learned to live within it. As the rains faltered and the harvests thinned, the cracks that had long been hidden within Maya society began to widen. Scarcity is a quiet destroyer. It doesn't strike with swords or fire, but with hunger and mistrust. When food became rare, so did loyalty. The cities that had once traded in gold, obsidian, and cacao now began to trade in suspicion and fear. The bonds that tied kingdom to kingdom, the delicate web of alliances, marriages, and diplomacy, started to fray. And in the growing silence of the drought, another sound began to rise: the rhythm of war drums. The Maya were no strangers to conflict. War had always been part of their world, woven into the fabric of their mythology. Kings fought not merely for land or power, but for divine legitimacy, to prove they were chosen by the gods. Blood was sacred. It nourished the heavens. Victories were celebrated with ritual sacrifice, defeats recorded in shame on stone stele. Yet, for centuries, even as rival cities clashed, there had been a balance, a rhythm of battle and peace that sustained the cosmic order. But when nature turned against them, that rhythm shattered. Now war became desperation. Cities that had once coexisted began raiding each other's lands for dwindling resources. Armies marched not to expand empires, but to survive. Inscriptions from this period tell stories of kings boasting not of glory, but of conquest over once friendly neighbors, a grim catalogue of hunger-driven violence. The great city of Tikal, for centuries a dominant power in the southern lowlands, found itself locked in endless struggle with Calakmul, its equally mighty rival. Between them stretched a patchwork of smaller city-states, each forced to choose a side or face destruction. The warfare grew relentless, ritual giving way to annihilation. Cities were sacked, captives executed, temples burned. The once magnificent hieroglyphic inscriptions, those graceful lines of poetry carved into stone, turned dark and fragmented. The artistry faded. The language of triumph became a language of death. Some rulers still claimed divine favor, still offered blood to the gods, but fewer believed them. The sacred theater of kingship was collapsing under the weight of real human suffering. The evidence of this turmoil is written in the stones. At Dos Pilas, archaeologists uncovered signs of siege and abandonment. Walls hastily built, weapons buried under rubble, skeletons left where they fell. The city had been powerful once, led by dynasties that traced their ancestry to the stars. But when the rivers ran dry and enemies closed in, the people fled into the forests. The temples, once lit by fires of ceremony, became tombs of silence. In the chaos, some rulers sought to tighten their grip, claiming that the drought and famine were divine punishments. Punishments that only they, the chosen mediators between gods and mortals, could reverse. But with every failed harvest, every unfulfilled prayer, that divine authority eroded. Faith became fractured. People began turning away from the towering centers of power, from kings and priests who offered only promises. The sacred cities became symbols of arrogance, monuments to leaders who had demanded obedience but delivered despair. And yet, not all the fighting was for survival alone. There were whispers of ambition even in collapse. Certain rulers saw opportunity in their neighbor's weakness. Chichen Itza, in the north, rose as others fell, its leaders consolidating trade and influence while the southern lowlands crumbled. It was a cruel irony. The fall of one world fed the rise of another. The Maya were not gone. They were evolving, violently, painfully. The jungle was not empty but shifting, like a great organism devouring its own dying parts to fuel new growth. The wars also changed the nature of Maya warfare itself. Where once captives had been taken for ritual sacrifice, a sacred exchange of life between kingdoms, now entire populations were displaced. Cities that resisted were razed, their people enslaved or scattered. The elegant rituals of battle gave way to scorched earth. The spiritual meaning of conflict decayed into raw, human struggle. The gods no longer guided the sword, hunger did. There's a haunting moment when one realizes that the Maya collapse was not just environmental or political, but deeply personal. Imagine a young warrior from Copan, returning to find his fields dust, his family gone, his city walls scarred with fire. Imagine priests still climbing the temple steps to perform rain ceremonies as thunderclouds gather on the horizon, but never break. Imagine kings who once sat on thrones of jade, now fleeing into the wilderness, stripped of their divine masks, mortal at last. The archaeological record tells us that by the late 9th century, many of the southern cities were in ruins. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, names that once defined an empire, had fallen silent. Warfare had consumed the region like wildfire. Those who survived moved northward, toward the Yucatan, where rainfall was more generous and trade routes remained open. But even there, the seeds of conflict followed. Chichen Itza's dominance sparked new rivalries, new ambitions. The pattern repeated, though on a smaller scale, as if the very DNA of power had been corrupted by centuries of struggle. And yet, amid the ruins of war, life persisted. Farmers continued to plant maize in the shadow of collapsed temples. Potters still shaped clay. Weavers still dyed their fabrics with color. Children were still born, stories still told. The Maya did not vanish, they adapted. But the age of divine kings, of monumental pyramids and cosmic calendars, was over. What remained was fragmented, scattered across time and jungle. In one haunting mural at Bonampak, the last flicker of that old world is preserved. It depicts warriors in triumph, captives bloodied and bound, nobles adorned in feathers and jade. But if you look closely, beyond the brilliance of the colors, you see something else: exhaustion. Faces drawn tight with fear and fatigue. Victory painted over desperation. It's as if even the artists knew that they were recording not glory, but an ending. The narrator's tone drops to a near whisper. In the end, the Maya were not destroyed by a single enemy. They were undone by the oldest force in human history. The hunger for survival turned against itself. As the wars burned on, the jungle crept back, reclaiming the blood-soaked ground. The sound of drums faded into the rustle of leaves. Where once cities had gleamed in the sun, now only moss and vines ruled. The monuments still stood, defiant and tragic, stone witnesses to the madness of a people who had conquered nature, only to be conquered by their own desperation. But even in this collapse, there's a strange beauty, the realization that the Maya story did not end with fire or famine, but with transformation. Out of war came migration, reinvention, renewal. The people who walked away from the burning cities carried not just their gods, but their knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, art. They would survive, though their civilization would not. The jungle took their temples, but it could never take their memory. The scene closes with the camera sweeping across the ruins of a once great city, half swallowed by forest. The narrator's voice lingers. When the world began to fall apart, The Maya fought not just for land or kings, but for meaning. And in the end, meaning was all they had left. When the rains failed and the wars tore the land apart, there was still one power the Maya could cling to: faith. For thousands of years, their gods had been their compass, their comfort, their explanation for the chaos of the cosmos. The Maya world was never a cold, silent universe. It was alive with divine purpose. Every star had a name, every tree a spirit, every drop of blood a meaning. The priests, cloaked in white and crimson, had been the bridge between heaven and earth, translating the mysteries of the gods into rituals, calendars, and sacrifice. But when the heavens grew silent, even the priests began to tremble. In the beginning, they tried harder. Faith, after all, is strongest when tested. Temples were rebuilt, higher than before, as if height alone could bring them closer to the sky. Offerings grew more elaborate: jade, feathers, incense, and blood. Rituals multiplied, each one an attempt to appease the gods who no longer answered. The priests' chants echoed through empty plazas, the smell of burning copal rising into a pitiless sky. But no clouds formed. No rain came. The fields stayed cracked and lifeless. And slowly, the people began to whisper what had once been unthinkable: that the gods had turned away. This was the beginning of the Maya's great spiritual unraveling, a crisis not of belief itself, but of relationship. For a civilization that saw the divine in every act, every season, the silence of the heavens was unbearable. The priests, who had once been living embodiments of cosmic order, found themselves powerless. Their calendars, once perfectly aligned with the stars, seemed meaningless when nature no longer obeyed its patterns. Prophecies failed, rituals failed, and failure for a priest was death, not always by sword, but by faith itself collapsing from within. There are inscriptions from the late classic period that depict rulers and priests performing rituals in haste, almost desperation. You can feel it in the carvings. Figures kneeling beneath stylized rain clouds, their hands raised in pleading, not command. The old confidence is gone. The gods they had served faithfully for centuries, Chak, the rain bringer; Itsamna, the creator; Nine-Chel, the mother, seemed to have vanished into the sky. Or worse, perhaps they were angry. The response was tragic and predictable: escalation. If the gods would not listen to prayer, perhaps they would listen to sacrifice. Blood had always been sacred, the thread that bound human and divine, but now it became an obsession. In some cities, the scale of human sacrifice increased dramatically. Captives were taken in greater numbers, hearts torn out in the desperate hope that life could buy life, that death could purchase rain. The plazas ran red beneath the blazing sun. But nothing changed. The people began to look at their priests differently. Once seen as holy mediators, they now seemed like false prophets. Rumors spread that the priests had lost the favor of the gods, that they no longer knew the true rituals, that perhaps they had offended the divine themselves. Faith, once unifying, became divisive. Local cults began to appear, small sects devoted to lesser gods or even new ones, household deities, forest spirits, ancestral ghosts. Spiritual authority fractured just as political authority had. The great pyramid temples stood tall, but their meaning was fading. Imagine the sight. A high priest standing on the temple steps at dusk, his hands dripping with sacrificial blood, his face painted with the blue of the rain god. Below him, the crowd watches in silence, waiting for thunder. He lifts his arms to the heavens, chanting words that have been spoken for centuries. The air is thick, the jungle quiet, and then nothing. No sound but the beating of his own heart. The priest lowers his hands slowly. The crowd begins to murmur, and somewhere deep inside him, a question he has never dared to ask takes root. What if no one is listening anymore? That moment, repeated across hundreds of cities and temples, was the breaking point. The gods, or at least the certainty of them, were slipping away. The priesthood, unable to provide answers, began to lose power. In some regions, the temples were abandoned. In others, they were defaced, the sacred carvings chipped away. People turned inward, to family, to survival, to the small personal rituals that could still give comfort. The grand cosmic order of the Maya had begun to collapse, replaced by something more human. Fragile, fearful, and uncertain. Archaeological evidence tells part of this story. In many late sites, altars appear hastily constructed, lacking the intricate artistry of earlier periods. Offerings become simpler, small clay figurines, burned food, handmade charms. It's as though the people were improvising new ways to speak to the divine, even as the old languages of faith crumbled. In one temple at Punta Laguna, archaeologists discovered the remains of a drought-era ritual. Bones of children sacrificed to Chak, the rain god, their bodies placed carefully in a cenote. It's horrifying, yet heartbreakingly human. An act of love and terror intertwined, parents offering the most precious thing they had left in exchange for salvation. But the gods remained silent. As the droughts deepened, some priests abandoned their temples altogether. Others joined the people in migration, carrying fragments of their idols with them. Broken stones, bits of jade, small effigies, as if the divine could be made portable. This scattering of sacred objects mirrors the scattering of the people themselves. The faith of the Maya didn't end. It diffused, spread thin across the land, transformed into countless local traditions. In the jungles of Guatemala, on the high plateaus of Chiapas, and in the valleys of the Yucatan, new forms of belief began to take shape. The collapse of the priesthood was not a single event, but a slow, echoing disintegration, one whispered prayer at a time. The temples grew cold, the sacred fires extinguished, the stele left unfinished. And yet, in that collapse, something remarkable happened. Without priests to define the boundaries of faith, the people began to redefine it for themselves. They found the divine not in grand rituals, but in the small endurance of daily life, in planting seeds, in singing to the rain that might never come, in burying the dead with dignity even when hope was scarce. Faith became intimate again. The gods were no longer distant cosmic rulers but companions in suffering, spirits who walked beside the people in their hunger, their fear, their exile. In the ruins of cities like Copan and Yaxchilan, archaeologists have found small household shrines built long after the official temples fell. It's proof that the Maya did not lose faith. They reshaped it to fit a new, broken world. By the end of the 9th century, the priesthood, once the spine of Maya civilization, had lost its hold. But the spirit of belief endured, quiet and unyielding, hidden in the hearts of those who survived. The gods were no longer found in the sky or the pyramids. They were found in the soil, in the rain when it came, in the simple act of survival itself. The narrator's voice would soften, echoing with both sadness and reverence. Perhaps the Maya did not lose their gods. Perhaps they learned that the gods were never in the temples at all, but in them. The screen fades to black, then opens on a new image. A crumbling temple swallowed by vines, birds circling above. The voice returns. The priesthood fell, but the faith found a way to live. There comes a point in every great civilization when silence becomes its loudest legacy. For the Maya, that silence began in the plazas. Once alive with color, song, and smoke, the markets that had overflowed with maize and cacao now stood empty. The sound of drums and laughter faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through hollow temples. The last fires flickered in the hearths of stone houses. People left, one family at a time, taking what they could carry. The few seeds that might still grow, the idols of their ancestors, the stories whispered to their children. What they left behind became ghosts of a world that no longer had a pulse. The jungle did not rush to claim them. It waited. Slowly, patiently, vines began to crawl over walls. Roots pried apart mortar. Birds nested where kings had once spoken to the gods. The temples that had taken generations to build began their return to nature, the carved faces of deities half buried beneath moss and shadow. For a long time, the ruins remained untouched, monuments to a vanished world, seen only by the jaguars, the howler monkeys, and the endless green. For centuries, the Maya had built their cities with the belief that stone could make them eternal. Every pyramid, every carving, every glyph was an act of defiance against time. Yet in the end it was time and the jungle that triumphed. The great centers of Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Calakmul fell not with thunder but with whispers. There were no invaders at their gates, no flames consuming their walls. The people simply walked away. The gods were silent, the kings powerless, the earth unyielding. The Maya left their cities to the forest, and the forest took them back. Imagine it, dusk falling over Tikal's temple of the great jaguar. The final rays of sunlight turn the limestone gold. A single priest lights the last offering before leaving. His footsteps echo against the stone, his torchlight flickering in the dark corridors. Behind him, the temple looms, silent, immense, eternal. By morning, the jungle mist will roll in, swallowing the city whole. Within a generation, no one will remember the path back. Archaeologists have found eerie traces of this departure. In abandoned homes, they've discovered cooking pots still filled with grain, tools neatly stored, altars left intact. These were not scenes of violence or panic. They were scenes of quiet surrender. The people did not destroy their cities. They outgrew them, or perhaps they understood that the land no longer wished them there. Some may have believed they were fulfilling a divine command, that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the great cities and demanded a return to simplicity. To leave may not have been defeat, but obedience. As the centuries passed, the jungle's embrace became absolute. The temples cracked under the weight of roots. Ceiba trees, sacred symbols of the connection between heaven, earth, and the underworld, sprouted in the courtyards of abandoned palaces. Birds carried seeds into the crevices of pyramids, and new life took hold where old life had fallen away. The forest became both tomb and guardian. The cities were gone, but they were not forgotten. They were sleeping. To those who later wandered these lands, the descendants of the Maya who remained, the ruins were sacred and terrifying. Stories grew around them like vines. Some said the temples were alive, that the old gods still lingered there, waiting for offerings. Others claimed that anyone who entered the old cities risked being lost forever, swallowed by spirits who despised being disturbed. These myths, born of awe and memory, became the thread that connected the living Maya to their vanished ancestors. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, hacking their way through the dense green, they could scarcely believe what they found. Towering pyramids, carved lintels, vast plazas hidden beneath centuries of vegetation. To them, it was as if a phantom civilization had risen and then been devoured by the earth. The Maya they encountered, farmers, villagers, storytellers, were living descendants of that ancient world, but the conquistadors could not see the continuity. They saw only mystery. How could a people capable of such greatness have vanished so completely? The irony, of course, is that the Maya never truly vanished at all. Their bloodlines, languages, and traditions endured in the people who lived in the shadow of those ruins. But for the outside world, the empty cities were too haunting to be anything but an enigma. The jungle had done its work well, concealing history, preserving it in secrecy. Even now, when archaeologists cut back the vines and reveal the temples, there's something unsettling about how alive they still seem. The carvings of gods and rulers stare out from the stone, their faces half erased by centuries of rain but still filled with power. You can feel it when you stand among them, that the city is watching you, that its silence is not empty but full of memory. The air hums with unseen presence. It's easy to romanticize this silence, to imagine it as peaceful. But it's also tragic. Each stone in those cities represents a life, a story, a prayer. To see them reclaimed by nature is to witness both destruction and rebirth. The jungle did not just erase the Maya, it also preserved them. In the cool shadows of the ruins, the carvings remain sharp, the glyphs still legible. The forest acted as a shroud, protecting the cities from the erosion of time. What was meant to be lost became eternal. There's a haunting beauty in the idea that the same earth that doomed the Maya also saved their memory. The droughts, the wars, the hunger, all of it faded, but the stones endured. Nature took back what was hers, but she didn't destroy it. She folded it into herself. When the modern world finally found these ruins again, It was like waking something that had been dreaming for 1,000 years. In the stillness of those ruins, we can almost hear echoes of the past, footsteps on stone, the murmur of markets, the distant chant of priests. The jungle hums with it, a low vibration of memory. Time in the Maya world was never linear. It was a circle, and perhaps the silence of the ruins is not an ending, but simply the pause between cycles, the deep breath before renewal. As the camera drifts through the misty canopy, over the tops of overgrown temples, the narrator's voice grows softer, reflective. The cities did not die. They returned to the earth that birthed them. The jungle did not destroy the Maya. It became their afterlife. Then, almost in a whisper, and maybe they wanted it that way, a single bird call echoes through the forest. The camera lingers on a moss-covered carving, the face of a king whose name has long been forgotten. Slowly, the vines sway in the humid air, and the jungle seems to breathe around him. The screen fades to black. For nearly 1,000 years, the cities of the Maya lay hidden beneath a living sea of green. The jungle, thick and relentless, wove itself over stone and memory alike. The world forgot the grandeur that once thrived there. Europe, chasing its own wars, crusades, and empires, had no idea that deep in the Americas, the remnants of a civilization older than many of its own kingdoms were sleeping beneath the roots of towering ceiba trees. The silence endured until the modern age, when the hunger for exploration, knowledge, and wonder brought strangers into the heart of that forgotten world. It began, as so many rediscoveries do, with whispers, tales told by local farmers and traders of immense ruins hidden in the forest, of stairways that led nowhere, of carved stones depicting gods and kings. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as exaggerations or myth. The few who believed them were those who lived closest to the forest, people who had always known that the old gods still slept beneath the vines. But in the 19th century, when the age of exploration reached the Americas, curiosity became obsession. Men with maps, notebooks, and machetes would soon stumble upon the ghosts of the Maya. One of the first to pierce that silence was John Lloyd Stevens, an American diplomat and adventurer, accompanied by the artist Frederick Catherwood. In 1839, they journeyed into the jungles of Central America, guided by local Maya who still spoke the language of their ancestors. What they found changed history: towering temples, crumbling palaces, intricate carvings. A city not merely ancient, but sophisticated beyond anything the Western world imagined the New World had produced. Stevens wrote of their discovery with awe, describing how the jungle seemed to breathe around them, how every step revealed another mystery. Catherwood's sketches captured what the eye could scarcely believe. Pyramids draped in vines, staircases swallowed by roots, walls covered in glyphs that no one could read. The images ignited the Western imagination like fire. Newspapers and salons across Europe and America buzzed with wonder. Who had built these magnificent cities? What had happened to them? The ruins were too vast, too intricate, too beautiful to fit the Western notion of indigenous peoples at the time. So many scholars refused to believe that the descendants of the Maya could have been their creators. Wild theories spread. Perhaps the lost tribes of Israel had wandered here, or survivors of Atlantis, or even refugees from Egypt. In their arrogance, explorers tried to separate the Maya from their own heritage, as if the idea that these people had built their own greatness was too impossible to accept. But for the Maya who still lived in the nearby villages, these ruins were not discoveries. They were memories, places of reverence and fear. The old names of gods and kings were still whispered in stories told by firelight. Even after centuries of colonization and suppression, fragments of the old beliefs survived. Rituals honoring the rain, the corn, the earth. When the foreign explorers arrived, asking questions, the local guides often looked at them with quiet amusement. To them, these ruins had never been lost. It was the rest of the world that had forgotten. Stevens and Catherwood's books, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, became a sensation. They brought the Maya back into the global imagination, not as myth but as history. And yet, even as scholars marveled at the architecture, the true mystery remained. Why had it all vanished? The deeper archaeologists dug, the more questions arose. The jungle yielded fragments of temples and tombs, pottery painted with scenes of gods and kings, and endless walls of hieroglyphs that no one could read. The Maya had left behind a vast written record, but the key to their language was lost, locked away in the curves and lines of their glyphs. For more than a century, those glyphs mocked the scholars. They were seen as mere decoration, art without meaning. But the truth was that they were words, sentences, histories, poems carved into stone. The Maya had spoken to the future, but the future could not yet hear them. The rediscovery of their language would come much later, through the patient brilliance of a few who refused to accept the silence. In the mid-20th century, scholars like Yuri Norizov, a Russian linguist, cracked the code, proving that the glyphs represented a complex, phonetic writing system, a true script as rich and expressive as any in the ancient world. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Maya could speak again. The stones began to tell their stories of dynasties, wars, alliances, gods, and dreams. As those voices emerged, the image of the Maya shifted from myth to humanity. They were no longer a vanished race swallowed by the jungle. They were a civilization of astronomers, mathematicians, engineers, and poets. The jungle had preserved their greatness, waiting for the world to be ready to listen. But the rediscovery was not without irony. The explorers who found the ruins were celebrated, while the descendants of those who built them remained largely invisible. Living in poverty, their language and culture still oppressed. For them, the monuments were not curiosities. They were ancestral wounds and sources of pride at once. The same pyramids tourists now climbed were once altars where their ancestors had prayed for rain, for survival. Modern archaeologists now walk those same paths with greater humility. They understand that the ruins are not relics of a dead world, but echoes of a living one. The Maya are still here in the highlands of Guatemala, the villages of Belize, the Yucatan, and Chiapas. Their languages are still spoken, their rituals still performed, their connection to the earth unbroken. The rediscovery of the ruins was never just about the past. It was about remembering that the Maya never disappeared. They were always waiting beneath the surface, in stone, in story, in blood. Picture this. The camera drifts over the dense canopy at dawn, mist swirling through the trees. A stone face emerges from the vines. A god half buried, half revealed. The narrator's voice cuts through the quiet. The world called them lost. But they were never lost, only hidden, watching, waiting for us to listen again. And as the morning sun rises over the jungle, lighting the ancient pyramids in gold, the story of rediscovery becomes something more. Not just the uncovering of ruins, but the reconnection of humanity with its forgotten wisdom. The Maya had built cities that defied time. It took us centuries to realize that what we were uncovering was not just history, but prophecy. A reminder that civilizations do not vanish. They transform, they sleep, and when the world is ready, they speak again. The rediscovery of the great Maya cities did more than awaken curiosity. It reopened an ancient wound in human memory. The question that began to haunt explorers, historians, and dreamers alike was not simply who the Maya were, but what happened to them. How could a civilization so advanced, so intricate, vanish from its grand cities almost overnight? Their stone temples still stood defiant against time. Their hieroglyphs spoke of knowledge and glory, yet the voices that once filled those plazas had faded into silence. The rediscovery of ruins like Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Calakmul only deepened the mystery. They were vast, meticulously designed, aligned with the stars, and supported populations in the tens of thousands, perhaps millions across the lowlands. And then, around the 9th century, the building stopped. The plazas emptied. The jungle began to reclaim what had been its own. Early archaeologists, working amid heat and mosquitoes, sifted through the remains of broken altars and toppled stelae, trying to decode the story hidden beneath the soil. What they found hinted not at a single cause, but at a chain of events, fragile, interconnected, and catastrophic. Theories multiplied like vines. Some spoke of droughts that lasted generations, others of endless wars between city-states. Still others imagined disease, rebellion, famine, or even divine punishment. The Maya collapse became one of history's greatest riddles, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. As more evidence emerged, the complexity of the story grew. The Maya civilization had not been a single empire, but a constellation of kingdoms, each with its own rulers, gods, and ambitions. They rose and fell in cycles, locked in alliances and betrayals, their histories carved in stone. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul waged wars that lasted centuries, each vying for dominance of the lowlands. The monuments tell of kings who declared themselves divine, of victories celebrated and defeats erased. But by the time the classic period neared its end, the tone of those inscriptions changed. The carvings grew fewer, their artistry less refined. The language of triumph gave way to silence. One clue lay in the environment itself. Scientists studying ancient lake sediments discovered that around the time of the Maya collapse, rainfall across the Yucatan sharply declined. The lush forests began to wither. Crops failed. Without rain, the great reservoirs that sustained the cities ran dry. For a civilization that depended on the rhythm of the seasons and the favor of the gods to bring the rains, such a drought would have been devastating. Yet even this explanation felt incomplete. The Maya were not helpless before nature. They had engineered vast systems of water management, built reservoirs and canals, and developed agricultural techniques capable of sustaining dense populations. So why had these systems failed? The answer may lie in the Maya themselves. Archaeological evidence suggests that as the population grew, the demands on the land increased beyond its limits. Forests were cleared to make way for farmland. Soil eroded. Resources dwindled. In their pursuit of monumental architecture and divine power, rulers may have pushed their cities past the point of recovery. The same brilliance that built their world may have doomed it, a tragic paradox that echoes through the ages. And yet, the collapse was not total. Even as cities in the southern lowlands crumbled, others in the north, like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, flourished for centuries afterward. The Maya civilization did not vanish. It shifted, adapted, and reimagined itself. The story of its decline was not a sudden extinction but a long, painful transformation. Some communities migrated to new lands. Others were absorbed into emerging cultures. The great kings fell, but the people endured. The temples decayed, but the prayers continued, whispered in hidden caves and along forest rivers. As researchers pieced together these clues, the narrative of the Maya's disappearance began to blur between science and myth. For the Maya themselves, the end of their great cities was not merely a social collapse. It was a cosmic event. In their worldview, time itself moved in cycles. Creation, destruction, renewal. Perhaps, to them, the fall of their civilization was not an ending but a passage, the closing of one great age before the beginning of another. There are haunting signs that the Maya knew their world was unraveling. Late carvings depict rulers performing increasingly desperate rituals, offering blood and sacrifice to appease gods that had grown silent. Temples from this final era are darker, their imagery more violent. It is as though the people felt the weight of destiny pressing upon them, the heavens closing in, the stars shifting out of their ancient patterns. In their mythology, the world had already ended and been reborn multiple times. Perhaps they believed they were witnessing another turning of that eternal wheel. Modern science paints a more tangible, but no less dramatic picture. Paleoclimatologists have traced shifts in the region's weather through layers of limestone and coral. Around the 800 CE, the Yucatan Peninsula experienced some of the worst droughts in millennia. Crops of maize and cacao, sacred to the Maya, failed year after year. Without rain, famine spread. With famine came unrest, rebellion, and the collapse of the social order. The kings who claimed divine authority could no longer deliver prosperity. Faith turned to fear, and loyalty turned to revolt. Imagine standing in the heart of Tikal during those final years. The once bustling marketplaces now echo with emptiness. The smoke from sacred fires drifts through abandoned courtyards. Priests ascend the steps of the temple, their chants desperate, pleading. The sky above is a pitiless blue, unbroken for months. The reservoirs below are cracked and dry. The jungle waits, silent and patient. In the end, The forest reclaimed what the Maya had built. Within a generation, vines coiled over the temples. The cities, once alive with color and ceremony, became green tombs. The gods, once fed with blood and devotion, retreated into the shadows. But not everything was lost. The people, the essence of the Maya, retreated too, into the highlands and forests, where they would survive conquests, diseases, and centuries of oppression. Today, archaeologists, historians, and descendants of the Maya continue to piece together this story. They know now that the disappearance was not the vanishing of a people, but the collapse of a way of life. It was a lesson written in stone and soil, that even the mightiest civilizations can fall, not through invasion or sudden catastrophe, but through the slow unraveling of the balance between nature, faith, and power. As the modern world faces its own challenges, deforestation, climate change, societal strain, the echoes of the Maya's fate sound eerily familiar. The stones they left behind are more than ruins. They are warnings. Each fallen temple, each forgotten city, whispers the same question. Can we hear them before it's too late? The rediscovery of their cities may have reopened the mystery of their fall, but it also revealed something profound, that the line between triumph and collapse is thin, and that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are fragile when they lose harmony with the world that sustains them. The Maya knew this truth better than most. Their story was not merely one of disappearance, but of transformation. A civilization that rose, fell, and still endures, reminding us that history does not end. It sleeps, waiting for us to listen. For generations, the story of the Maya's disappearance seemed to hang suspended between myth and speculation, a puzzle made of half-truths and broken stones. But as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, a new kind of exploration began. The age of machetes and sketchbooks gave way to satellites and laser scanners. Science, armed with precision technology and data, turned its gaze toward the jungle, peeling back the layers of time that had hidden the truth for 1,000 years. What those machines uncovered was nothing short of astonishing, a revelation that rewrote everything historians thought they knew about the Maya world. The breakthrough came from the sky. Using LiDAR light detection and ranging, researchers fired millions of laser pulses from aircraft flying high above the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. The lasers penetrated the thick canopy and reflected off the ground below, creating a detailed digital map of the terrain. When the first images came back, archaeologists could hardly believe what they saw. Beneath the forest that had long appeared endless and untouched lay the faint outlines of entire cities, highways, terraces, and fortifications. A civilization far larger and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. What had once been thought of as a handful of isolated city-states was revealed to be a vast network, spanning hundreds of miles, connected by elevated causeways that stretched across rivers and valleys. Tens of thousands of previously unknown structures emerged from the data: homes, temples, markets, fortresses, and reservoirs. The population estimates exploded overnight. Where scholars once believed the Maya lowlands held perhaps a few million people at their height, LiDAR suggested numbers closer to 10 or even 15 million. It was as if an entire lost world had risen from the green sea of the jungle. And with it came new questions. If the Maya civilization was this immense, this organized, and this advanced, then its collapse must have been even more catastrophic than previously thought. LiDAR revealed something else too: signs of intense environmental manipulation. The Maya had transformed their landscape with astonishing precision. Massive terraces carved into hillsides prevented erosion and expanded farmland. Networks of canals controlled the flow of water through swampy regions. Reservoirs and cisterns captured rain for the dry season. Cities were planned according to cosmic alignments, merging architecture with astronomy and religion. They had built an empire not of conquest but of harmony, a balance between human ambition and the natural world. And yet, that balance was fragile. The data also showed signs of overexploitation. Forests cleared on a massive scale, soil degradation, and evidence of drought cycles that grew more severe over time. Using cores from ancient lake beds, scientists discovered layers of sediment that recorded centuries of climate change. Each layer was like a heartbeat, pulsing through time. Around the 9th century, those beats faltered, rainfall sharply declined for decades, possibly centuries. The droughts, once manageable, became unrelenting. Crops failed, reservoirs dried, and the carefully engineered balance of the Maya world began to collapse. But technology alone could not explain the emotional or cultural dimensions of this fall. Archaeologists began combining scientific data with the deciphered hieroglyphic texts, creating a timeline not just of environmental stress, but of human decision-making. The inscriptions from this era tell of desperate kings performing increasingly elaborate rituals, wars erupting over dwindling resources, and alliances crumbling under the weight of fear. The story that emerged was no longer one of a single cause, but of many forces converging: environmental collapse, political instability, social unrest, and perhaps even spiritual despair. Still, LiDAR and modern archaeology didn't only tell a tale of decline. They revealed resilience, evidence that the Maya adapted in remarkable ways. In some areas, populations shifted to smaller, more sustainable communities. Trade routes changed, economies diversified, and new centers of power rose even as others fell. This new vision of the Maya collapse wasn't an apocalypse. It was an evolution. Civilizations, like ecosystems, don't die easily. They change shape, they decentralize, they find ways to endure. As the data poured in, scientists realized that even the concept of collapse might be misleading. The Maya didn't vanish, their urban centers did. But their people continued to live, to speak their languages, to remember their gods in whispers and rituals. The jungle may have reclaimed their cities, but not their spirit. In many ways, LiDAR was not just revealing ancient structures. It was revealing continuity, the invisible thread connecting the past to the present. The discoveries also challenged Western ideas about technological progress. The Maya had no metal tools, no beasts of burden, no wheels, and yet they engineered cities that rivaled those of classical Greece and Rome. Their astronomical knowledge rivaled that of ancient Egypt. Their mathematics included the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. Their entire civilization was sustained through cooperation with nature, a delicate symbiosis that modern societies often forget. As new excavations began based on LiDAR maps, more details emerged. Hidden temples beneath later constructions, entire districts devoted to astronomy, and evidence of vast marketplaces that linked distant cities in trade. Obsidian from the highlands, jade from the mountains, and shells from the coasts all flowed through this invisible network. The Maya were not an isolated culture. They were part of a continental web of exchange and influence. But perhaps the most haunting revelation came not from the stones, but from the people still living nearby. In many modern Maya villages, the old knowledge never truly disappeared. Farmers still read the seasons by the stars, still perform rituals to honor the earth and the rains. When archaeologists arrived with their machines and maps, some of the elders simply nodded, as if to say, "You are late. We already knew." Modern science had finally caught up to ancient memory. The LiDAR scans might have revealed the outlines of temples and causeways, but the descendants of the Maya had preserved something even more precious: the understanding that the earth is alive, that human survival depends on respect, not conquest. In a strange way, the lasers and satellites did not just uncover ruins, they uncovered humility. Each new discovery pulled back another layer of mystery, yet the deeper researchers looked, the more the past seemed to mirror the present. The collapse of the Maya, seen through modern eyes, became less a mystery of disappearance and more a mirror of warning, a story of what happens when balance is lost. Climate instability, political division, overexploitation of resources. The same forces that once toppled cities of stone now whisper through our own modern world. And so, amid the hum of drones and the glow of computer screens, scientists and descendants alike stand at the threshold of understanding. The jungle still holds secrets, perhaps entire cities still unseen beneath its canopy. But one truth has become clear: the Maya were never lost. We simply lacked the tools to see them. Now, with light itself as our guide, we are learning to read the earth the way they once did, to see civilization not as a monument of power, but as a living system, fragile and sacred. In the end, LiDAR did more than uncover ruins. It reminded humanity that beneath every forest, every forgotten land, there may still lie the memory of brilliance, waiting, silent, patient, for someone to ask the right question. To understand the Maya is to step into a world where time was not a straight line, but a living, breathing circle, infinite, sacred, and inescapable. For them, the universe was not random chaos but an intricately woven pattern of destiny and divine rhythm. Every sunrise, every rainfall, every victory and death was part of a cosmic order written long before humans walked the earth. Their kings ruled not merely through might or lineage, but through their ability to interpret and align with this great celestial design. The Maya didn't just observe the heavens. They conversed with them. And it was in this dialogue between stars and stone that the secret of their civilization's greatness, and perhaps its downfall, can be found. From the earliest villages of the pre-classic era, the Maya saw the cosmos as a living entity. The sky was a vast ocean of gods, each star a deity with its own will and purpose. The sun, the moon, and the planets weren't distant bodies of rock and fire. They were beings whose movements carried messages, omens, and divine instructions. The Maya didn't build their cities randomly. Every temple, every avenue, every plaza was constructed according to celestial alignments. Their architecture was a mirror of the heavens. When you stand atop the temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, the shadow of a serpent slithers down the pyramid during the equinox, a manifestation of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, descending from the sky to bless the earth. This was not mere symbolism. It was ritual science, precision guided by cosmic devotion. Time for the Maya was sacred geometry in motion. They created calendars so advanced that they remain among the most accurate ever devised. The long count calendar could track cycles of creation and destruction stretching back thousands of years, and forward into the future. Each cycle was believed to be a world unto itself, destined to rise, flourish, and fall before being reborn. The Maya didn't see collapse as annihilation, but as transformation, the closing of one cosmic age to make way for the next. To them, even destruction was divine balance. The priests, astronomers, and scribes who tended these calendars were not scientists in the modern sense. They were guardians of cosmic harmony. They believed that human actions could influence the favor of the gods and thus the stability of the cosmos itself. Rulers performed bloodletting rituals not out of cruelty or superstition, but as acts of cosmic renewal. The spilling of royal blood symbolized the giving of life energy back to the universe, ensuring that the sun would rise, that rain would fall, that the stars would stay in their courses. In their worldview, to rule was to maintain the heartbeat of the world. And so, their kings became living bridges between the heavens and the earth, embodiments of divine power. Every war, every harvest, every construction project was guided by celestial timing. The great wars between city-states were not only struggles for political control, but battles to claim cosmic legitimacy. To defeat a rival was to prove that your gods, your calendar, your destiny were stronger. The stelae that line the plazas of Copan, Tikal, and Quirigua are not just monuments to human ambition. They are records of cosmic participation. Each inscription connects earthly deeds to the cycles of Venus, the moon, or the sacred calendar. Yet this obsession with time and cosmic precision was a double-edged blade. When the heavens began to shift, when droughts came, when crops failed, when the signs no longer aligned with the rituals, the faith that bound the Maya world began to fracture. Imagine a priest gazing at the stars and realizing that the patterns no longer matched the prophecies. Imagine a king who had promised rain but could no longer summon it. The calendar that once gave meaning to every action now became a reminder of failure. The gods had grown silent, or perhaps they had turned away. Some archaeologists believe that this spiritual crisis may have accelerated the Maya decline. When cosmic order faltered, so did political authority. The priests and kings who claimed divine favor could no longer maintain their power. The people began to lose faith, and the social fabric unraveled. The great temples, once filled with incense and chants, became hollow echoes of past glory. The precision that had guided the Maya became a kind of trap, a rigid faith in a cosmic order that offered no mercy when nature itself began to rebel. And yet, within that same cosmology lies a haunting beauty. The Maya did not see themselves as separate from the earth or the heavens. They were part of a single, breathing whole. They believed the ceiba tree connected all realms. Its roots in the underworld, its trunk in the world of the living, and its branches reaching into the heavens. To harm the earth was to wound the body of the gods. To forget the cycles of time was to forget one's place in the cosmos. In this way, their spirituality was both their triumph and their vulnerability. It is no coincidence that when the great droughts came, the Maya turned not to conquest, but to ceremony. Across the lowlands, archaeologists have found offerings buried in dry reservoirs, jade beads, shells, even human sacrifices, gifts meant to reawaken the gods of rain and renewal. These were not acts of desperation but of devotion, born from a belief that the world could be restored if the balance were honored. But the rains did not return, and with them went the last remnants of faith in the divine order. Still, the Maya understanding of time endured. Even after the cities fell silent, their descendants carried the sacred calendars through the centuries. When Spanish friars arrived in the 16th century, they were astonished to find that the Maya could still predict eclipses and solstices with uncanny accuracy. The invaders tried to erase this knowledge, burning codices, outlawing rituals, and replacing gods with saints. But the cycles continued in secret, hidden within Christian festivals and whispered prayers. The Maya never stopped counting the days. Centuries later, the world would rediscover that ancient calendar in the most unexpected way, during the frenzy over the so-called Mayan prophecy of 2012. Popular media distorted it into a doomsday prediction, claiming the Maya foresaw the end of the world. But in truth, the calendar did not foretell destruction. It foretold renewal, the closing of one great cycle, the birth of another. It was not an ending, but a turning of the wheel. The ancient vision had returned, misunderstood yet still alive, echoing across millennia. When you look at a Maya temple today, when you run your fingers across the weathered glyphs carved in stone, you are not just touching history. You are touching a philosophy of existence. One that sees time as sacred, death as renewal, and civilization as a breath in the great rhythm of creation. Their downfall was not a failure of knowledge, but a reflection of cosmic truth. Everything rises, everything falls, and from the ruins, new worlds are born. Perhaps that is why the Maya mystery still haunts us. In their fall, we glimpse our own fragility. In their calendars, we see our own cycles of growth, greed, and imbalance. The Maya believed the universe would always find a way to correct itself, to restore harmony, no matter the cost. And maybe, in their silence, they are still whispering the same message to us, that the end is never the end, only another beginning. The Maya world was not one empire under a single banner but a mosaic of kingdoms, each pulsing with its own ambition, art, and belief. It was a civilization bound not by conquest but by shared cosmology and trade, by bloodlines and war, by the intricate rhythm of alliances that could shift as suddenly as the wind through the ceiba trees. When we look at the ruins today, what we see as stillness was once a vibrant, living network of human life, bustling marketplaces, sacred plazas, and kings who believed their every decision echoed in the heavens. At its heart, the Maya world was a web of cities connected by causeways called sakbiob, white roads made of crushed limestone that shimmered in the moonlight. They stretched across jungles, valleys, and marshlands, linking kingdoms in both unity and rivalry. These roads were not just trade routes. They were arteries of civilization, carrying jade, obsidian, cacao, feathers, salt, honey, and stories from one city to another. Through them flowed the lifeblood of a people who prized both material wealth and spiritual power. Every city was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by a Keuhula Jah, a divine lord whose authority was seen as a reflection of the gods. In cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan, these rulers built monumental temples to proclaim their divine legitimacy. Each stela carved in stone was a declaration of lineage, victory, and cosmic alignment. These kings were not content to merely govern. They sought immortality through architecture and inscription. The stones they left behind were their voices, words meant to echo through eternity. But beneath the splendor of temples and palaces, the Maya world was deeply human. Farmers rose before dawn to tend maize fields that sustained the great cities. Artisans shaped jade into sacred ornaments, and scribes bent over bark paper codices filled with glyphs of prophecy and time. The rhythm of daily life was marked by rituals. The lighting of incense, the grinding of maize, the offering of prayers to the gods of rain and fertility. The Maya were not a civilization of warriors alone. They were astronomers, poets, and mathematicians. Their greatness lay as much in their minds as in their monuments. Still, power was never far from the surface. The kings of the Maya lowlands existed in a delicate balance. Allies today could be enemies tomorrow. Wars were fought not only for land but for captives, for blood, and for prestige. To capture a rival king or noble was to claim his divine essence, to feed it to the gods through ritual sacrifice. These wars, though often small and symbolic, were brutal in their significance. Entire dynasties rose and fell on the outcome of a single battle. The stelae that celebrate victory often hide the silent grief of the defeated. Cities burned, families enslaved, temples desecrated. At its peak, the Maya political landscape resembled a grand game of cosmic chess. Tikal and Calakmul, two of the greatest powers, waged a struggle for dominance that lasted centuries. Their rivalry shaped the destiny of dozens of smaller kingdoms caught between them. Each sought to expand its influence through marriage alliances, trade control, and religious prestige. The war between these superpowers wasn't fought in isolation. It rippled through the entire lowland world, drawing even distant cities into its web of loyalty and betrayal. In times of peace, diplomacy and culture flourished. Royal marriages were political tools, binding kingdoms together in fragile harmony. Nobles traveled across the region to participate in rituals, trade, and learning. Art and architecture mirrored this exchange. You can see the influence of one city's style in the carvings of another, the shared motifs that hint at a civilization in constant dialogue with itself. But the peace was always temporary, a pause between storms. The social structure of Maya life was both rigid and complex. At the top stood the divine kings and queens, followed by nobles, priests, scribes, and artisans. Below them were the farmers and laborers who built the temples and fed the cities. Slavery existed, though it was often tied to warfare and ritual rather than birth. Even the humblest peasant lived within the spiritual framework of the cosmos. Planting maize was an act of worship, and the harvest a communion with the gods. To live was to serve the balance of nature and divinity. The women of the Maya world were not mere figures in the background. Queens like Lady Six Sky of Naranjo or Lady Cable Zook of Yaxcalan wielded immense political and spiritual power. Inscriptions show them performing bloodletting ceremonies, advising their husbands, and even leading armies. They were embodiments of the goddess principle, life-givers and mediators between worlds. Their strength reminds us that Maya society, for all its hierarchies, was also deeply spiritual and symbolic, bound by the dualities of life and death, male and female, creation and destruction. Trade, meanwhile, was the invisible force that united the Maya world. Canoes laden with goods glided along rivers and coastal routes, connecting the inland cities to distant shores. Jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland Guatemala, shells from the Caribbean, and feathers from the rainforests of Chiapas, all flowed through a vast economic network. The marketplaces were more than centers of commerce. They were spaces of connection, where ideas and languages intertwined. Through trade, the Maya world remained alive, vibrant, and ever-evolving. Religion infused every layer of this society. There was no separation between the sacred and the mundane. The act of building a home, planting a seed, or going to war was inseparable from ritual meaning. The gods were everywhere, in the wind that moved through the trees, in the rain that fell upon the maize, in the stars that guided their calendars. Temples were not merely places of worship but cosmic machines, designed to maintain the rhythm between heaven and earth. Every sacrifice, every offering, was a thread in the great tapestry of cosmic order. And yet, the very system that gave the Maya strength also made them fragile. Their civilization was so interconnected, so dependent on ritual harmony, that when droughts came or kings fell, the disruption spread like cracks in glass. When one city burned, others trembled. When the gods seemed to turn their faces away, the entire network of belief began to waver. It was this interdependence, this web of trade, faith, and politics, that made the Maya both brilliant and vulnerable. In the end, the great cities became victims of their own grandeur. The ambition of kings led to overextension. The devotion of priests led to excess. The weight of ritual, once a bond, became a burden. Yet even as the monumental centers faded, the people endured. Villages continued to thrive, farmers kept planting, and the old rituals adapted to new realities. Civilization, in its truest sense, did not end, it simply shifted from the temples to the fields, from the kings to the commoners. When we walk today among the ruins of Tikal or Palenque, it is easy to imagine that we are standing in a dead world. But the truth is more complex, more human. The stones still hum with memory of laughter, prayer, trade, betrayal, and love. The Maya civilization was not a story of sudden collapse, but of transformation, of a people who built a world so intricate that even its fading was beautiful. Their cities may have fallen, but their spirit still pulses beneath the roots and leaves, beneath the earth that remembers every footstep. In the heart of the jungle, where vines twist around ancient stones and howler monkeys call like echoes of the past, once stood the divine rulers of the Maya, men and women who were not merely kings and queens but living gods. To the Maya, power was not a matter of politics alone. It was cosmic. Each ruler was believed to be chosen by the heavens, born at a moment inscribed in the stars, destined to serve as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Their blood carried the essence of the gods. Their words were the voice of the universe. And in their courts, beneath pyramids that rose like stairways to eternity, the fate of entire cities was decided not by human will alone, but by the interpretation of sacred time. Every Maya king was more than a monarch, he was a priest-astronomer, a keeper of balance. His duty was to sustain Kea, the sacred energy that flowed through the cosmos and into the human world. To fail in this duty was to risk cosmic disorder, drought, famine, rebellion, even the end of time itself. Thus, a ruler's power was constantly renewed through ritual acts of devotion, bloodletting, sacrifice, divination. The shedding of royal blood was not symbolic. It was the ultimate offering, proof that the ruler's body was both human and sacred. The stingray spines that pierced their flesh, the obsidian blades that drew lines of crimson across their skin, these were instruments of cosmic maintenance. In pain, the gods were fed, and the world kept turning. Imagine the scene in the city of Yaxchilan. The evening air thick with smoke and incense, torches flickering against the carved faces of gods. A queen, Lady Cable Zook, kneels before her people, a rope of thorns drawn through her tongue. Her blood drips onto strips of paper, which are burned so that the smoke may carry her essence to the heavens. From that smoke, visions are born, ancestors, spirits, serpents of flame. Her husband, King Shield Jaguar, stands beside her, watching the boundary between worlds blur. This was not brutality. To the Maya, it was beauty, a sacred act of communication that kept the universe alive. Such rituals were not performed in isolation but as part of the larger theater of kingship. A ruler's legitimacy depended on spectacle, on the ability to embody divine power in public. Every coronation, every victory celebration, was a performance written in mythic language. Dancers moved in elaborate costumes depicting gods and ancestors. Priests recited chants that traced the lineage of kings back to the first dawn. And as the people watched, they did not see men in masks. They saw the return of deities, the eternal cycle of creation repeating before their eyes. Yet, beneath this divine facade, kings were also deeply political beings. Their power depended on alliances, trade routes, and military strength as much as divine favor. The Maya understood that cosmic order and earthly order were reflections of each other. A king who lost a war risked losing the mandate of the gods. Victories were therefore not only military achievements but sacred validations. When a ruler captured an enemy lord, he did not merely gain territory. He absorbed his rival's divine essence. The captives were paraded through the city, bound and humiliated, before being sacrificed on temple steps. their deaths feeding the gods, their spirits legitimizing the conqueror's rule. In the inscriptions that survive, we can trace this divine competition. King Tikal's emblem glyph carved beside the defeated symbols of Kalakmul. The record of a capture, the name of a slain rival, the date aligned with the stars, these were not just historical records. They were cosmic declarations. Every battle was a reenactment of myth, every conquest a repetition of the gods' own wars in the heavens. The rulers believed they were maintaining the same order that once separated light from darkness. But divine power was a dangerous gift. To be a living god was to live under immense pressure. The king's every failure could be interpreted as a sign of imbalance. A poor harvest, a solar eclipse, a rebellion. All could mean the gods were displeased. And when that happened, the ruler had to restore harmony through ever more elaborate ceremonies. Bloodletting intensified, sacrifices multiplied, monuments were raised higher, inscriptions carved deeper. The Maya elite, in their desperation to please both gods and people, began to consume their own strength. As cities grew, so did their hunger. Temples demanded more laborers, wars demanded more captives, rituals demanded more blood. The divine kings, once protectors of balance, became prisoners of their own cosmic duty. To falter was to fall, and many did. The ruins of once great cities bear witness to dynasties that vanished almost overnight. A line of rulers might end with a single failed harvest or a rebellion sparked by hunger. Beneath the grandeur of divine kingship lay the fragility of a system that tied the fate of thousands to the body and blood of one. And yet, for centuries the system held. It worked because it inspired awe and belief. The common people, laboring in fields or hauling stones for temples, saw their rulers as necessary intermediaries. To serve the king was to serve the gods. When he ascended the pyramid to speak with the heavens, they believed the rain would follow. This spiritual bond created unity and perhaps even resilience in times of hardship. The divine kings did not merely command loyalty. They embodied hope. But hope can turn to fear. When omens began to darken the skies, when droughts lingered, when the stars seemed to shift from their sacred paths, people began to question the divine order. If the kings were truly gods, why did the rivers dry? Why did the maize wither? Why did death come so freely? The very faith that had once upheld the system began to erode it from within. Temples that once celebrated kings now bore signs of neglect. Stele ceased to be carved. The divine voice grew silent. Even so, fragments of their power survived. In remote villages, the stories of sacred kings endured in myth. The descendants of those who once bowed before Tikal's rulers still speak of times when humans walked with gods, when the world itself was sustained by the blood of kings. These memories linger not as nostalgia but as warning. A reminder that the line between devotion and destruction is thin, that the belief in divine authority, however glorious, carries within it the seeds of collapse. The Maya rulers left behind no single testament, no final inscription that explains their fall. What remains are the echoes, the images carved in stone, the fragments of ritual objects buried beneath temples, the faint traces of red pigment that once symbolized divine life. To look upon these remnants is to glimpse a civilization where power and faith were indistinguishable, where every drop of royal blood was a prayer, every pyramid a plea to keep the heavens in motion. And as the jungle slowly reclaimed their cities, it was as if the gods themselves had withdrawn, taking with them the secret of how mortals once held the universe in their hands. The Maya lived not just in space, but in time. To them, time was not a straight line leading from past to future. It was a vast, breathing organism, a cycle that consumed and renewed itself eternally. Every sunrise was a rebirth of the world, every passing year a pulse in the divine heart of the cosmos. The Maya did not simply measure time. They worshipped it, recorded it, lived by it. Their priests and astronomers studied the heavens with an intensity that bordered on obsession. For in the slow movements of the stars they saw messages from the gods, warnings, promises, destinies written in light. To stand beneath a Maya sky on a clear night must have been to witness eternity. The constellations were not abstract arrangements of stars. They were deities and myths, spirits whose actions shaped the fate of the world below. The Milky Way was not a galaxy, it was the Sac-B, the White Road, the celestial counterpart of the sacred causeways that connected their cities. Venus was the harbinger of war and renewal, its bright rise marking moments when kings took captives or empires clashed. The sun itself was a divine traveler, dying each evening in the underworld and reborn at dawn. The Maya watched it all, carefully, patiently, generation after generation, until they understood the rhythm of the universe with a precision that still amazes modern science. Their calendar systems were among the most sophisticated the ancient world ever conceived. There were several, interlocking like gears in a cosmic machine. The 260-day Tsokin measured sacred cycles, the time of gestation, of spiritual birth, of ritual. The 365-day Hab followed the solar year. Together, they formed the calendar round, a repeating cycle of 52 years, after which all combinations of dates began anew. But beyond these was the long count, the grand reckoning of cosmic time itself. It measured not years or centuries, but epochs, vast cycles of creation and destruction. To the Maya, the world was not eternal but periodically reborn, each age ending in cataclysm before a new one began. It was through this understanding that they reached back thousands of years into mythic time, tracing the birth of the current world to a specific date, August 11, 3114 BCE, in our calendar. That moment, they believed, was when the gods raised the sky from the primordial sea, when time itself began to flow. To mark time was to participate in creation. To count the days correctly was to maintain harmony with the divine order. The priests who kept these calendars were not merely mathematicians, they were guardians of the universe. Imagine the sight in a Maya city on the morning of a great astronomical event. Priests ascending the pyramid steps, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first spark of Venus to pierce the dawn. They would have spent months, even years, calculating the precise moment of its reappearance. When it came, horns would sound, incense would rise, and the entire city would erupt in ritual. For the people, it was proof that the cosmos was still in balance, that the gods were still with them. But for the kings, these celestial alignments were also moments of immense political power. To launch a war or crown a new ruler at a divinely aligned moment gave their actions legitimacy beyond question. In this way, astronomy was both religion and politics, a tool of both faith and control. The architecture of the Maya cities reflects this celestial devotion. Temples and pyramids were not built at random. They were aligned with precision to the solstices, equinoxes, and planetary cycles. At Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of Kukulkan stands as perhaps the most spectacular example. During the equinox, the setting sun casts a shadow down the staircase, forming the shape of a serpent slithering toward the earth, the god Kukulkan returning from the heavens. At Uaxacton, observatories were constructed to track the solstices, while at Köppen, stelae marked key astronomical events. The entire landscape became a calendar written in stone, a living clock that tied heaven and earth together. The precision of their astronomical observations still stuns modern scientists. They could predict solar and lunar eclipses centuries in advance. They knew the exact length of the solar year, more accurately than the Julian calendar used in Europe until the Renaissance. They tracked Venus's cycle with remarkable accuracy, understanding that its 584-day period had symbolic meaning tied to warfare and renewal. Their calendar tables were so advanced that they could extend millions of days into the future, creating a framework of time that stretched beyond the lifespan of any civilization. But to the Maya, this was never about science alone. The movement of celestial bodies was a moral and spiritual guide. The heavens did not merely mark time, they revealed destiny. Every day carried its own personality, its own divine essence. Children born on certain days were believed to inherit particular traits and fates. Farmers planted according to the sky's rhythms. Kings chose dates for rituals not by convenience but by cosmic alignment. The entire society moved in time with the universe, as though every human action were part of a grand celestial choreography. This profound relationship with time also carried a darker side. If time was cyclical, then destruction was inevitable. Every cycle, no matter how glorious, had to end so that a new one could begin. The priests who studied the long count were keepers of both creation and doom. When they saw signs of imbalance, droughts, wars, eclipses, they feared that the end of the current age might be approaching. This fear bred urgency. More sacrifices, more ceremonies, more attempts to hold back the turning of the cosmic wheel. It's possible that in the final centuries before the Great Collapse, the Maya became trapped by their own understanding of time. As their environment changed and cities faltered, they may have believed they were witnessing the unraveling of an age. The heavens that had once promised order now foretold chaos. When the stars no longer aligned with the prosperity of their kings, faith turned to desperation. The astronomer priests, once revered as masters of the cosmos, may have become prophets of doom. Centuries later, when Western scholars rediscovered the Maya ruins and began to decipher the glyphs, they were astonished by the depth of astronomical knowledge encoded in stone. What had been dismissed as superstition revealed itself to be a science of staggering precision. The Maya were not primitive stargazers, they were cosmic engineers, weaving time and space into a system that still challenges modern understanding. Yet even as we admire their brilliance, we sense the melancholy beneath it. For in the Maya worldview, time could not be conquered, only obeyed. No matter how carefully they measured it, no matter how perfectly they aligned their cities with the heavens, the cycles would still turn, the ages would still end, the stars would still burn out and be born anew. Theirs was a wisdom both awe-inspiring and tragic. The knowledge that nothing, not even civilization itself, escapes the rhythm of creation and destruction. Perhaps that is why their monuments still stand as they do, silent, eternal, yet haunted by absence. The pyramids that once marked the heavens now crumble beneath tangled vines. The stars still move as they always have, indifferent to the rise and fall of those who once worshipped them. But in their geometry, in their alignment with the celestial dance, the Maya left behind their truest legacy. The reminder that time is not our enemy, but our mirror reflecting what we build, what we lose, and what endures. To the Maya, the land was not a possession, it was a living, breathing being. Every tree, river, and mountain carried a spirit, a voice that spoke through wind and rain. The earth was the mother of maize, the source of life and sustenance. To till her soil was to perform an act of communion, not conquest. The Maya did not see nature as separate from themselves. They were part of its endless rhythm of birth, growth, and decay. Yet, in the centuries before their great cities fell silent, this sacred balance between people and earth began to strain, and ultimately to break. The Maya world stretched across a vast range of environments. From the humid lowland jungles of the Petén Basin to the drier plains of the Yucatan Peninsula and the highland valleys of Guatemala. Each landscape demanded its own form of ingenuity. In the swamps and floodplains, farmers built raised fields called bajos, lifting their crops above the waterlogged soil. In the hills, they carved terraces into the slopes, catching rainfall and preventing erosion. Along the coasts, salt and fish sustained communities that traded deep into the interior. Their mastery of adaptation was astonishing, a symphony of human intelligence and ecological respect. At the heart of their agriculture was maize, ixim, the sacred grain of creation. According to Maya myth, humans were formed from maize dough, molded by the gods after earlier creations of wood and clay failed. Maize was not merely food, it was identity. To eat maize was to renew one's connection to the divine. Every planting season began with offerings to the chucks, the rain gods, and to the earth deities who guarded the fertility of the fields. The rituals were precise. A few drops of blood to awaken the soil, prayers to call the clouds, songs to guide the seeds. Alongside maize grew beans, squash, chili, and cacao, the pillars of the Maya diet. These crops complemented one another, replenishing the soil and creating a nutritional balance. The Maya were among the first to practice sustainable polyculture on a massive scale, transforming even marginal lands into productive farms. They understood the language of rain and drought, of the dry season's waiting and the wet season's renewal. Their calendars were tuned to the agricultural cycle, ensuring that every harvest aligned with celestial and earthly time alike. But abundance has its price. As populations grew, the demand for food, wood, and water increased. Great cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan required enormous resources to sustain their temples and palaces. The construction of monuments devoured forests. Every limestone block was baked in kilns fueled by timber. To feed tens of thousands of people, more fields had to be cleared, more hillsides stripped. Slowly, the dense jungle that had once protected the soil began to recede. The rivers ran thinner, the rains more erratic. What had begun as harmony turned, quietly, into imbalance. The climate, too, began to change. Modern scientists studying lake sediments and cave formations have found evidence of severe droughts in the 9th century. Long periods when rainfall nearly vanished. The Maya, so dependent on seasonal rains, faced an existential crisis. Their reservoirs dried, their crops failed, and famines spread through the land. For a civilization that saw nature as divine, such disasters were more than environmental. They were cosmic betrayals. The gods, it seemed, had turned away. Imagine the scene. The once thriving city of Tikal, its reservoirs cracked and empty, its temples still towering but eerily silent. Farmers look to the sky for rain that never comes. Priests offer sacrifices, first of animals, then of captives, and eventually perhaps even of their own, to beg for mercy. The sacred fires burn, but the smoke drifts aimlessly into a cloudless sky. The rituals that once guaranteed balance now bring only despair. The forests around the cities, stripped for generations of wood, could no longer protect the fragile soil. Erosion followed. The once rich topsoil washed away in the rains that did come, leaving the ground infertile. Fields had to be moved farther and farther from the city centers, forcing farmers to travel longer distances and weakening the economic bond between rulers and people. The system that had fed and enriched the Maya world began to collapse under its own weight. Yet even in crisis, the Maya did not surrender easily. Archaeological evidence shows that they experimented with new water systems, canals, reservoirs, and underground cisterns called chultans. They built terraces to capture what little rainfall remained and sought new ways to manage their environment. This resilience speaks to their brilliance. Even as the world changed around them, they fought to adapt. But sometimes, no matter how ingenious a people may be, the land itself dictates the limits of survival. As the droughts deepened and resources dwindled, cities that had once thrived on trade and tribute began to turn inward. Competition for fertile land and remaining water sources intensified. Neighboring kingdoms, already rivals, began to raid each other not for glory but for survival. War, once a ritual of cosmic renewal, became a desperate struggle for existence. Trade routes faltered, alliances fractured. Inscriptions from this period grow fewer, perhaps because there were fewer scribes left to write them, or because the stories they told were too grim to carve in stone. There is a tragic irony in this fall. The very ingenuity that allowed the Maya to dominate their environment became the cause of their undoing. Their cities were so successful that they exhausted the ecosystems that sustained them. The balance between humanity and nature, once maintained through careful ritual and observation, tipped beyond recovery. The gods of rain and earth, if they ever existed outside the human imagination, seemed to have abandoned the land they once blessed. And yet, in smaller, more remote communities, life went on. Away from the great cities, farmers and villagers endured. They simplified their rituals, adjusted their crops, and lived with the land rather than upon it. The Maya civilization may have collapsed in its monumental centers, but the people, the Maya themselves, did not vanish. Their descendants still plant maize, still offer prayers for rain, still speak the same languages that once echoed through the plazas of the gods. The jungle reclaimed what humanity abandoned. Vines crept over the stones, roots split temples apart. In time, the earth healed itself, swallowing the scars of both greatness and greed. To walk among those ruins today is to feel that quiet revenge of nature, a reminder that no matter how advanced a civilization may become, it is still bound to the soil, to the rivers, to the unseen forces that give life and take it away. What the Maya understood and perhaps forgot is that the land remembers. Every forest cut, every seed planted, every drop of blood spilled into the ground becomes part of its memory. The disappearance of their cities was not the end of the world, but a return, the earth reclaiming what was always hers. The Maya world was built upon delicate threads of loyalty, faith, and power, threads that, for centuries, held firm across kingdoms and dynasties. But as the skies hardened and the earth grew silent, those threads began to fray. What had once been a network of alliances turned into a web of distrust. Kings who once called each other brothers in ritual began to see one another as rivals for survival. In a world where divine authority rested upon prosperity, the failure of crops or the absence of rain was not seen as bad luck. It was a sign that the gods had withdrawn their favor. And when the gods abandoned one king, his neighbors saw an opportunity to rise. The political landscape of the classic Maya world was never peaceful. It was a civilization of competing city-states, each ruled by its own divine lord, the Keuhula, and each hungry for prestige and tribute. For centuries, this rivalry was tempered by ritual warfare, battles fought to capture rather than annihilate, conflicts that reaffirmed the cosmic order rather than destroying it. But when drought and famine struck, that ritual order began to unravel. Hunger does not recognize ritual. Starvation does not honor the sacred. The wars that once fed the gods began to feed only desperation. Inscriptions from the final centuries of the classic era, around the 8th and 9th centuries, reveal a world at war. Cities that had once prospered through trade and diplomacy began to record victories that were fewer, bloodier, and more chaotic. The great powers, like Tikal and Calakmul, that had once vied for dominance now faced internal unrest. Smaller cities rebelled against their overlords, seizing the chance to claim independence while the great kingdoms weakened. Regional conflicts multiplied. Armies burned rival cities not to capture kings but to destroy their temples, erase their lineage, and claim their resources. The fall of Tikal, long the jewel of the southern lowlands, was not a single event but a slow bleeding. For centuries, it had been locked in an epic struggle with Calakmul, a rivalry that defined the classic Maya age. Both cities built alliances, courted vassals, and fought wars that drained their treasuries and their people. When the rains failed and the trade routes faltered, both giants collapsed under their own weight. Their fall created a vacuum that smaller kingdoms rushed to fill, sparking even more wars. The Maya world became a battlefield of fading gods. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of these final centuries. Defensive walls sprang up around cities that had never needed them before. Massive fortifications encircling palaces and temples. Weapons, once ceremonial, became tools of survival. The stelae that once celebrated divine rule now grew silent. Some were deliberately defaced, the faces of kings chiseled away as if to erase their failure. In Köpen, the last known ruler, Yak's passage Chan Yopat, struggled to hold his kingdom together, but his monuments speak of anxiety and decline. Within decades of his death, Köpen was abandoned, its royal line extinguished. As order crumbled, faith itself began to falter. The divine kings, once seen as living gods, could no longer guarantee prosperity or balance. When the rains did not come, when disease spread, when famine consumed entire generations, people began to question the very foundations of their world. In some cities, rulers intensified their rituals, spilling more blood to appease the gods. In others, the people turned against their leaders. Temples were burned, idols smashed, priestly elites overthrown. The same divine authority that had once united the Maya now tore them apart. This unraveling was not only political or spiritual, it was deeply human. Imagine the despair of a farmer whose fields have withered for years, watching his children starve while priests demand sacrifices for rain that never falls. Imagine the soldiers, exhausted from endless wars, returning to find their homes burned, their families gone. In such a world, loyalty becomes meaningless. What begins as rebellion becomes an exodus. People fled the great cities, abandoning the monumental centers that had defined their civilization for centuries. They returned to smaller villages, to the forests and hills, seeking safety and sustenance away from the crumbling temples of failed gods. In this mass movement of people, the very structure of Maya society dissolved. The divine kingship, the cornerstone of their world, lost its legitimacy. The scribes and artisans who once chronicled royal deeds found themselves without patrons. The traders who once carried goods along sacred routes found those roads broken and unsafe. The collapse was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow suffocation, a loss of trust, of faith, of order. Each city fell not with a single blow, but through decades of decay, rebellion, and abandonment. The archaeological record reflects this disintegration vividly. Excavations show once grand palaces repurposed into makeshift dwellings, ceremonial plazas filled with common refuse, burials of elites found hastily interred, their graves lacking the splendor of earlier generations. The intricate system of hieroglyphic writing, once flourishing on stelae and codices, dwindled to silence. It was as if the voice of the Maya world itself had gone mute. But there is a haunting beauty in this silence. The final monuments, those carved in the late 9th century, seem almost self-aware, filled with omens and prophecies, warnings of endings. In Quirigua and Ceibal, rulers recorded long count dates that stretched far into the future, as if defying the chaos around them, proclaiming that time itself would endure even if kings did not. The last stelae are less about triumph and more about remembrance. Echoes of a world slipping away, carved by hands that must have known they were among the last. Some historians believe the collapse was less a single event than a migration of power. As the great southern lowland cities fell, new centers emerged in the north, places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, where different models of governance arose. These cities were more collective, less dependent on divine kingship. Power shifted from hereditary rulers to councils of nobles and military orders. It was, in a sense, a reinvention of the Maya world, a civilization learning to survive without its gods. Yet, the memory of the old order lingered. The myths of divine kings, of gods who walked among mortals, of cosmic balance and sacred blood, remained etched in the stories passed from one generation to another. Even in their decline, the Maya carried their world with them, in their languages, their rituals, their sense of time. The collapse of the political system did not erase the soul of the civilization. It merely changed its form. When we look at the ruins today, with their toppled stelae and silent temples, we are tempted to see only tragedy, the fall of a great people to war, famine, and faith's failure. But perhaps it was also liberation. The end of kingship freed the Maya from the crushing weight of divine obligation. In abandoning their cities, they returned to something older, more intimate, the direct bond between humanity and the earth. What fell was not a people but a system too heavy for its own foundation. And in that quiet collapse, as the jungle began to reclaim the stone, the Maya world did not die. It merely transformed. Its heart continued to beat in the villages and mountains, in the whispers of farmers planting maize beneath the same stars that once guided kings. The gods had not vanished. They had simply moved closer to the ground. Even after the great cities fell silent, the Maya spirit did not fade into oblivion. The people who once built towering temples and mapped the stars carried their traditions into the highlands and forests, where new communities rose from the ashes of the old. The sacred calendar continued to guide their planting and harvests. Their rituals still marked the cycles of the sun, and their stories preserved the memory of divine kings and cosmic battles. In art and myth, fragments of the old world survived, carved into wooden idols, painted on humble ceramics, whispered in the Popol Vuh, their great book of creation. Even as new powers like Chichen Itza and Mayapan emerged, the Maya reshaped their identity, adapting to a harsher, more uncertain age. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, they found not a vanished race but a living culture, wounded, transformed, yet enduring. The jungle may have swallowed their temples, but it could not erase their soul. In every glyph, every melody, every prayer whispered beneath the ceiba tree, the Maya world still breathed, quiet, resilient, eternal. Centuries after the last kings had fallen and the jungle had sealed their monuments in green silence, whispers began to drift through the colonial world. Rumors of vast stone cities hidden in the forests of Yucatan and Guatemala. In the 19th century, explorers like John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood hacked their way through the dense undergrowth and stood awestruck before temples and pyramids no European had seen for centuries. Their sketches revealed a civilization of astonishing sophistication, one that had mapped the stars, mastered mathematics, and built monuments aligned with celestial precision. The world was stunned. The Maya were no longer a forgotten mystery. They were proof that the Americas had birthed greatness long before Columbus. Yet, as archaeologists uncovered more temples and glyphs, a deeper realization dawned. This was not the story of a vanished people, but of a living culture that had survived in the faces and voices of modern Maya descendants. The jungle had not hidden a ghost. It had guarded a memory, waiting for the world to remember. The stones spoke again, and through them, the Maya began to reclaim their place not as a lost civilization, but as an eternal one. In the end, the mystery of the Maya is not one of disappearance, but of endurance. Their temples may crumble, their kings long forgotten, yet their spirit continues to breathe through the forests, the language, the rhythm of life itself. The same sun that once crowned the pyramids still rises over the maize fields where their descendants work, whispering the same prayers, tracing the same constellations. The jungle did not bury a dead civilization. It protected a living one, waiting for the world to listen again. In their story lies a quiet truth, that nothing truly vanishes, only changes form. The Maya understood time not as a line but as a circle, every fall a return, every silence a preparation for song. And perhaps that is their final gift to us. The reminder that even in ruin, beauty persists. Even in loss, meaning endures. What we call the end, they would have called the turning of the wheel, the eternal rhythm by which all things live, die, and are reborn.